We remain thankful for all the blessings we have received, for the strength to overcome challenges, and for the wisdom to address critical issues our country faces. As we buckle down to our task of crafting and passing laws for the welfare of our people, may you always enlighten us with your spirit, so we may deliberate with respect and humility. May we stand firm with our principles and live with compassion and respect for the dignity of all human life. Sa panahon ng pangangailangan, patnubayan niyo po kami. Sa panahon ng kadiliman, tanglawan niyo po kami ng liwanag, at sa panahon ng anumang di pagkakaunawaan, magibabaw sana lagi ang katwiran at malasakit sa isa't isa. Inidudulog po namin ito sa ngalan ng Panginoong Hesukristo. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Senator De Lima. The Senate Choir will lead us in the singing of the Philippine National Anthem.
Sa dagat at bundok, sa simuyan, sa langit mong bukaw, may lagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang isat ng patawat mo'y tagumpay na nagniningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng malapit pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang ligaya na may makaapi ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Secretary, please call the roll.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senators Angara, Aquino, Pinay, Cayetano, De Lima, Drilon, Ejercito, Escudero, Gatchalian, Gordon, Honasan, Ontiveros, Lacson, Ligarda, Pacquiao, Pangilinan, Po, Recto, Soto, Trillanes, Villanueva, Villar, Subiri, Senate President Pimentel.
Sino ang Trillanes lang? There are 23 senators present. The chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we dispense with the reading of the journals of the 50th session, Tuesday, January 17, 2017, and the 51st session, Wednesday, January 18, and consider the same as approved.
Is there any objection? Two journals are being approved. There being none, the motion to dispense with the reading of the journals of January 17 and 18 and consider them as approved is hereby approved.
Mr. President, I move to consider for third reading Senate Bill 1269 under Committee Report number 15 to avail of the presence of the members of the Senate.
Can I have the script muna? 12, what is it?
1269.
1269. There is a motion to approve on third reading.
Consider for third reading.
To consider on third reading Senate Bill number 1269. Any objection? There being none, the motion is approved.
Mr. President, may we ask the Secretary to read the title of the measure?
Secretary, please do so.
An act providing for the registration, licensure, and practice of food technology in the Philippines, providing funds therefore and for other purposes.
Mr. President, printed copies of the measure were distributed last January 19, 2017, thereby complying with the 3-day rule. I therefore move to vote on third and final reading Senate Bill 1269 or the Philippine Food Technology Act through a roll call vote.
There is a motion now for us to vote and approve on third reading Senate Bill number 1269. Any objection? There being none, we will conduct a roll call vote. Secretary, please.
Roll call vote of members. The Honorable Senators Angara, Aquino, Binay, Cayetano, De Lima, Drilon, Ejercito, Escudero, Gatchalian, Gordon, Honasan, Hontiveros, Lacson, Ligarda, Pacquiao, Pangilinan, Po, Recto, Soto, Trillanes, Villanueva, Villar, Subiri, Senate President Pimentel.
With 23 affirmative votes, Senate Bill number 1269 is approved on third reading.
Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
Any objection? There being none, the motion is approved. Secretary, please do the reference of business.
Bills on first reading. 1295, an act granting benefits and privileges to junior citizens, introduced by Senator Grace Poe.
Referred to the Committees on Women, Children, Family Relations and Gender Equality, Health and Demography, Ways and Means and Finance.
1296, an act requiring the provision of infant-friendly facilities in government agencies and major establishments of the Philippines, Senator Joel Villanueva.
To the Committee on Women, Children, Family Relations and Gender Equality.
Resolutions. Resolution number 262, resolution directing the proper Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the reported need to craft guidelines to curb and limit the alleged iniquitous and unreasonable surge pricing of transport network companies, Senator Grace Poe.
Public Services.
263, resolution congratulating and commending the outstanding young men 2016 awardees, Senator Joseph Victor Ejercito.
Rules.
264, resolution directing the Senate Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs to investigate, in aid of legislation, the truth and veracity of the allegation that certain public officials had received payola from Cebu drug lord Jeffrey Jaguar Diaz for the purpose of providing remedial legislation thereto to increase the accountability of erring public officials in compliance with the constitutional mandate that public office is a public trust, Senator Lacson.
Committees on Public Accountability, Public Officers and Investigation, Public Order and Dangerous Drugs.
265, resolution directing the Senate Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs to inquire, in aid of legislation, on the various reported incidents of kidnap for ransom perpetrated by members of the Philippine National Police in the guise of enforcing Project Tokhang, which is a centerpiece program of the war on drugs of the administration of President Rodrigo Duterte, with the end in view of expediting the seeming slow and soft action of the PNP on the perpetrators of said dreadful and appalling activities, and ultimately providing remedial legislations that will hasten the investigation and prosecution of similar incidents, Senator Lacson.
Public Order and Dangerous Drugs.
266, a resolution directing the appropriate Senate committees to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the state of the rehabilitation and relief efforts in schools affected by Typhoon Nina, Senator Paulo Benigno Bam Aquino IV.
Public Works.
267, a resolution directing the appropriate Senate committees to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the status of post-disaster recovery in the lawin-ravaged Cagayan Province, Senator Paulo Benigno Bam Aquino IV.
National Defense and Security.
Communications, letters from the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas transmitting to the Senate copies of the following certified and authenticated BSP issuances in compliance with Section 15A of Republic Act Number 7653. Circular letter numbers CL-2016-105, 106, 107, dated 22, 28, 29 December 2016. Circular number 938, dated 23 December 2016, and Memorandum Number M-2016-025 dated 28 December 2016.
Banks, financial institutions, and currencies.
Committee report. Committee report number 26 prepared and submitted jointly by the Committees on Banks, Financial Institutions and Currencies, and Ways and Means on Senate Bill number 1297 with Senators Drilon, Recto, Escudero, Joseph Victor, Ejercito, and Sani Angara as authors thereof, entitled, "An Act Amending Republic Act Number 7653, otherwise known as the New Central Bank Act, and for other purposes," recommending its approval in substitution of Senate Bill numbers 16, 859, 1027, and 1148. Senator Escudero.
Calendar for ordinary business. Majority Leader.
What was the additional? Are we done with the additional reference of business, Mr. Secretary?
I am not aware that there is one, Mr. Majority Leader.
So may we have the additional reference of business, Mr. President, because my next motion is contained in the additional reference of business.
1 minute suspension with the permission of the Chamber. I-distribute niyo.
Yeah? We're ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed. Majority
President,
Leader,
may we have the additional reference of business?
the Secretary will read the additional reference of business.
Messages of the President of the Philippines. Letter of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, dated 29 December 2016, submitting for the Senate's considerations and concurrence the arms trade treaty which was adopted on 2 April 2013 at the United Nations General Assembly.
Committee on Foreign Relations.
Letter of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, dated 12 January 2017, submitting for the Senate's consideration and concurrence the agreement between Japan and the Republic of the Philippines on Social Security, which was signed on 19 November 2015 in Manila.
Referred to the Committee on Foreign Relations.
Message from the House of Representatives. Letter from the House of Representatives informing the Senate that on 16 January 2017, it passed the following House bills, House Joint Resolution in which it requests the concurrence of the Senate. House Bill number 4636 entitled An Act Granting the Iloilo Baptist Church, Incorporated, a franchise to construct, install, establish, operate, and maintain radio and television broadcasting stations in the Philippines.
Committee on Public Services.
1425, an act renaming the Akop, Tublay, Kapangan, Kibungan, Bacon, Sinipsip, Bugias Secondary National Road in the province of Benguet to Governor Badudangwa National Road. House Bill number 2656, an act naming the Diversion Road in Sorsogon City, province of Sorsogon, as Salvador H. Escudero in Escudero the Third Diversion Road. House Bill number 2708, an act renaming the Goril, Bukod, Kabayan, Abatan Road in the province of Benguet to Congressman Andres Acop, Cosalan Road. House Bill number 2785, an act renaming the Wawa Road at Barangay San Rafael, Municipality of Rodriguez, Province of Rizal as General Licerio I. Jeronimo Highway. House Bill number 4602, an act naming the intersection of Jose Abad Santos Avenue, Gapan, San Fernando, Olongapo Road, and the Guagua, Florida Blanca Provincial Road located at the border of Barangay San Antonio and Barangay Jose Abad Santos, both in the municipality of Guagua, province of Pampanga, as the William Gulanco Junction.
Committee on Public Works.
House Bill number 4660, an act naming the bypass road stretching from Barangay Bengkag, City of Lawag to Barangay Buyon, Municipality of Bacara, Province of Ilocos Norte as the Rodolfo G. Farinas Jr. Bypass Road.
Committee on Public Works and Finance,
2158, an act rationalizing and expanding the powers and duties of the Social Security Commission and the Social Security System, further amending for the purpose Republic Act number 1161 as amended by Republic Act number 8282, otherwise known as the Social Security Act of 1997.
Committee on Government Corporations and Public Enterprises, Labor, Employment, and Human Resource Development,
4631, an act renewing for another 25 years the franchise granted to Republic Broadcasting System Incorporated, presently known as the GMA Network Incorporated, amending for the purpose Republic Act number 7252, entitled an act granting Republic Broadcasting System Incorporated a franchise to construct, install, operate, and maintain radio and television broadcasting stations in the Philippines.
Public Services,
4637, an act extending for 25 years the franchise granted to Smart Communications Incorporated, formerly Smart Information Technologies Incorporated, amending for the purpose Republic Act number 7294, entitled an act granting Smart Information Technologies Incorporated a franchise to establish, install, maintain, lease, and operate integrated telecommunications, computer, electronic services, and stations throughout the Philippines for public, domestic, and international telecommunications and for other purposes.
Committees on Public Services, Ways and Means,
Joint Resolution number 10, joint resolution increasing the monthly pension of the Social Security System pensioners under the Social Security Act of 1997.
Committee on Government Corporations and Public Enterprises, Labor, Employment, and Human Resource Development.
Bills on first reading. 1298, an act providing free, appropriate public education to children with disabilities, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes, by Senator Joel Villanueva.
Education, Arts and Culture, Social Justice, Welfare and Rural Development, Finance.
1299, an act providing that 100% of the service charge collected in hotels and other establishments be distributed to all covered employees and for other purposes, Senator Joel Villanueva.
Labor, Employment, and Human Resource Development.
1300, an act allowing the transfer of maternity leave benefits granted to women workers in case of the latter's death due to childbirth, further amending Section 4-A of Republic Act number 1161 as amended, and for other purposes, Senator Joel Villanueva.
Women, Children, Family Relations, Gender Equality.
1301, an act declaring the last Monday of January as the National Faith Day, Senator Joel Villanueva.
Education, Arts and Culture.
1302, an act extending the 25 years the franchise granted to Smart Communications Incorporated, amending for the purpose Republic Act number 7294, entitled an act granting Smart Information Technologies Incorporated a franchise to establish, install, maintain, lease, and operate integrated telecommunications, computer, electronic services, and stations throughout the Philippines for public, domestic, and international telecommunications and for other purposes, Senator Subiri.
Committees on Public Services and Ways and Means.
1303, an act providing a financial benefit to host communities of energy generating facilities, Senator Win Gatchalian.
Public, Energy.
Resolutions. Number 268, a resolution directing the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an investigation in aid of legislation as to the enforcement and proper implementation of Republic Act number 9344 as amended, otherwise known as the Juvenile Justice Welfare Act of 2006, for the purpose of examining the effectivity of the existing law and proposing amendments to further strengthen the provisions that protect the rights of children in conflict with the law. Senator Win Gatchalian.
Justice and human rights, women, children, family relations, gender equality.
269, a resolution directing the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an investigation in aid of legislation as to the proper implementation of the laws on the regulation of online gaming, examining the effectivity of the existing law and proposing amendments to further strengthen provisions to curb illegal gambling and protect the economic interest of the state. Senator Win Gatchalian.
Games and amusement.
270, a resolution directing the Senate Committee on Government Corporations and Public Enterprises to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the proposed increase in the contribution rate of Social Security system with the end in view of ensuring the welfare of its members and pensioners. Senator Recto.
Government corporations, public enterprises, labor employment, human resource development.
271, resolution directing the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the proliferation of misinformation and fake news sites in social media platforms, particularly on Facebook. Senator Pangilinan.
Public information and mass media.
272, resolution directing the Senate Committee on Urban Planning, Housing and Resettlement to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the alleged substandard housing units under the AAP PNP housing program implemented by the National Housing Authority. Senator Joseph Victor Ejercito.
Urban planning, housing, and resettlement.
273, resolution directing the Senate Committee on Public Works to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the delay of the installation of utilities such as water and power, access to transportation and construction of community facilities, roads leading to resettlement sites in Yolanda-stricken areas, with the end in view of crafting laws, rules, and regulations in improving the service of providing basic utilities and facilities in resettlement areas affected by disasters. Senator Joseph Victor Ejercito.
Public works and public services.
274, resolution directing the Committee on Cooperatives joint with the Committee on Labor, Employment, and Human Resources Development to conduct an investigation in aid of legislation on the illegal practices of labor service cooperatives. Senator Saberi.
Labor, employment, and human resource development cooperatives.
275, resolution directing the proper Senate Committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the alleged need to review the compliance of telecommunication companies and responsible government agencies with Republic Act number 10639 or the Free Mobile Disaster Alerts Act in light of news reports that several stakeholders in affected areas failed to receive alerts on Typhoon Nina. Senator Grace Poe.
Public services, public information, and mass media.
276, resolution congratulating and commending University of the Philippines professor and scientist, Professor Dr. Alonso A. Gabriel, for being a recipient of the 2016 Japan International Award for Young Agricultural Researcher given by the Japan International Research Center for Agricultural Sciences. Senator Pangilinan.
Rules.
Committee report number 27 submitted by the Committee on Local Government on Joint Resolution Number 6 introduced by Senator Saveri entitled Joint Resolution Declaring January 17 of every year as James Leonard Tagle Gordon Day, a special non-working holiday in the city of Olongapo and the Subic Bay Freeport Zone in recognition of the achievements, contributions, and heroism of James Leonard Tagle Gordon. Recommending its approval without amendment, sponsor Senator Sani Angara.
Calendar for ordinary business. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, Senator Subiri was supposed to deliver a privileged speech, but he has opted to do it another time, perhaps tomorrow, Mr. President. I'd like to acknowledge some guests of the Senate, the Union ng mga Manggagawa sa Agrikultura, with Danilo Ramos, Secretary General, and Sister Pat Fox in the Senate. I'd like to welcome them, Mr. President.
Let the presence of our guests be made of record.
Thank you. Mr. President, with the permission of the Chamber, I move to transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special order Senate Bill 1297 under Committee Report Number 26.
Any objection? So transferred.
I move to consider Senate Bill 1297 under Committee Report Number 26.
Any objection? Hearing on consideration of the measure is in order.
May we ask the Secretary to read the title of the measure?
Secretary will read the title of the measure.
An act amending Republic Act Number 7653, otherwise known as the New Central Bank Act, and for other purposes.
Mr. President, to sponsor the measure, may we ask the Chairman of the Committee on Banks, Financial Institutions, and Currencies, Senator Chis Escudero, be recognized.
The Chairman of the Committee on Banks, Senator Chis Escudero, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, distinguished Majority Floor Leader. Mr. President, honorable colleagues, good afternoon. As your chairperson of the Committee on Banks and Financial Institutions and Currencies, I rise to sponsor Committee Report Number 26, which recommends the approval of Senate Bill Number 1297, entitled An Act Amending Republic Act Number 7653, otherwise known as the New Central Bank Act, and for other purposes. It is a bill prepared by your committee in substitution of Senate Bill Number 16,859 and 1027 and 1148, authored by Senators Drilon, Recto, Ejercito, and this representation. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, public hearings and technical working group meetings were held on September 5, 13, and on October 11, 2016. As a background, Republic Act Number 7653 created the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, or BSP, pursuant to the directive of the 1987 Constitution, mandating an establishment of an independent central monetary authority. The BSP replaced the old Central Bank of the Philippines, which had been established by Republic Act Number 265 way back in 1948. 20 years after, the economic milieu in the Philippines has changed. Globalization has increased the integration of financial markets, and the scope of operations of financial institutions have evolved. Undoubtedly, there is a need to respond to contemporary challenges by amending Republic Act Number 7653 in order that the BSP shall remain effective in its conduct of monetary policy and supervision of entities within the financial system. The following would be the salient features of the proposed bill, Mr. President. The bill proposes to strengthen the tools with which the BSP exercises in performing its mandate, supplement the mechanism in protecting savings of depositors, and ensure the smooth flow of transactions in the financial system, as well as to enhance the corporate viability of the BSP. These are as follows. Number one, strengthening the BSP's monetary stability function. The bill seeks to restore the authority to obtain data for purposes of statistical and policy development, as well as ascertaining compliance with laws and banking regulations, and the authority to issue negotiable certificates of indebtedness, even during normal times, both of which were powers granted to the old Central Bank of the Philippines. And number two, the removal of thresholds in the growth of monetary aggregates, credit, and prices as guiding principles in monetary administration in view of current international trends in monetary policy frameworks adopting inflation targeting, quote unquote. Second, strengthening the BSP's financial stability function. A formal statutory recognition of the BSP's mandate of promoting and maintaining financial stability in close coordination with other relevant agencies, as well as the grant of statutory oversight of payment and settlement systems, will now be given to the Bangko Sentral, similar to what has been given or is given for financial stability to central banks of China, Malaysia, and Singapore. Third, enhancing BSP's prudential supervision function. Enhancement of BSP supervision shall be done under the proposed bill through the following: expanding the entities it supervises to include other categories of financial institutions, granting authority to impose sanctions on transfers and acquisitions of substantial shares of banks and quasi-banks without approval of the BSP, allowing full flexibility to conduct risk-based supervision of financial institutions, strengthening of administrative and criminal sanctions to include, among others, forfeiture of profits from unauthorized financial transactions, and improving resolution mechanisms to deal with problematic financial institutions. A second way by which the bill seeks to enhance BSP's prudential and supervision functions would be the legal protection for BSP officials and staff when performing official duties similar to that provided to officers and employees of the Philippine Deposit Insurance Corporation, or PDIC, under the latter's Charter, Republic Act Number 9576, as amended by Republic Act Number 10846. Fourth, strengthening the BSP's corporate and financial viability. We seek to do this through the following: additional capitalization of the BSP of 150 billion payable upon the effectivity of the Act. Grant of flexibility to establish adequate loss allowances and create reserve buffers against future risks and contingencies, and the restoration of tax exemption similar to other central banks in the world. And the enhancement to credit operations by granting exemption from court processes relating to collaterals obtained from banks similar to that enjoyed by the Land Bank of the Philippines, and the authority to deputize the BSP legal staff in extrajudicial foreclosure of mortgaged properties in the same manner that the legal staff of Land Bank and DBP have been so deputized under their respective charters. Excuse me. Other salient features of the bill, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, include the following: the increase in the number of deputy governors from 3 to 5. A new section on authority to approve transfer of shares was included. This is a proactive measure to prevent the entry of undesirable persons in supervised entities. It is meant to ensure that controlling interests are pre-qualified before they take actual control of the supervised institutions. These amendments, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, will empower the BSP to effectively respond to the challenges and innovations of a globalized economy, and more significantly, to better perform its constitutional mandates. Indeed, an empowered BSP is indispensable in ensuring a competitive, robust, and inclusive economy, attractive to investments and business that generate employment and promote inclusive growth, as well as a financial system that will support a higher quality of life for every Filipino. Mr. President, I ask our colleagues to consider and help me in passing this measure contained in Committee Report number 26 with respect to Senate Bill number 1297. I submit, Mr. President, and thank you.
Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. To give the other senators time to study the proposed measure, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1297 under Committee Report number 26.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of the measure is suspended.
Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move to transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders Senate Joint Resolution number 6 under Committee Report 27.
Any objection? Hearing none. So transferred.
Mr. President, I move to consider Senate Joint Resolution number 6 under Committee Report number 27.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration is in order.
May we ask Secretary to read the title of the measure, Mr. President?
Joint resolution declaring January 17 of every year as James Leonard Tagle Gordon Day, a special non-working holiday in the city of Olongapo and the Subic Bay Freeport Zone in recognition of the achievements, contributions, and heroism of James Leonard Tagle Gordon.
Mr. President, to sponsor the measure, may we recognize the Chairman of the Committee on Local Government, Senator Sani Angara.
Senator Angara is recognized to sponsor the measure.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Majority Leader, distinguished colleagues. January 17 of this year marked the birth centenary of an important local figure, James L. Gordon, the father of Olongapo City and its first elected mayor. Mayor Gordon was initially born an American to an American father and a Filipino mother. While the rest of his family elected to become American citizens and moved to the United States, James L. Gordon chose to stay in the Philippines. Arguably, he may have been more Filipino than many of his native-born counterparts. Perhaps the decision was about testing his fortunes in a country rebuilding itself after the cataclysm of war. Perhaps it was driven by patriotism for the Philippines flowing through his blood, given his maternal grandfather, Jose Tagle, valiantly led the Battle of Imus, the first major battle of the Philippine Revolution. Whatever his reasons for staying, James L. Gordon had a meaningful and long-lasting impact on the lives of the citizens of Olongapo as well as his fellow Zambaleños. An entrepreneur and successful businessman, James L. Gordon was always civic-minded, sticking to the belief that great things are achievable through leadership and collective action. He helped organize the Olongapo Civic Action Group, the Olongapo Rotary Club, the Olongapo Knights of Columbus, and the Olongapo Businessmen's Association. These are organizations which enabled communities to work together for shared aims, many of which still exist today. With his wife Amelia Huico Gordon, he set up the Olongapo Boys Town and Girls Home to care for wayward and orphaned children. As Deputy Governor of Zambales, he was part of the panel that worked for the turnover of Olongapo from U.S. control to the Philippine government in 1959. He also worked to promote transparency and accountability throughout government, campaigning vigorously against illegal logging and smuggling of cigarettes, firearms, and other contraband. He was a crime and corruption buster, fighting to block anomalous transactions by officials, investigating why heavy equipment from the United States could not be accounted for, and working to remove an unscrupulous police chief. Since the four-year turnover of Olongapo was completed in 1963, his fellow Olongapeños called on him to be their first chief executive, and he won handily. During this time, despite ardent opposition, he successfully lobbied a measure that converted Olongapo into a full-fledged city, enabling it to grow and develop into what it is today. His service to Olongapo, however, was cut short in 1967 when he was shot by an escaped inmate. Mayor Gordon's outspoken ways and hardline stance against corruption and crime did not always win him friends in politics, but they earned him the widespread respect and admiration of his people. He may have been born an American, but his life was lived to the fullest here in the Philippines. His funeral march is said to be the biggest outpouring of grief by Olongapeños for any of their local figures. Since then, Olongapo City has made it a point to celebrate on his birth anniversary his life and achievements. So on his birth centenary, simultaneous wreath-laying ceremonies were conducted in Calalake Elementary School, Tapan Park, which is the site of where the mayor was born, Gordon Memorial Park in Calaclan, where he was interred, and Marikit Park, which is located in the heart of Olongapo City. Mr. President, your Committee on Local Government is sponsoring Joint Resolution 6 as a sign of solidarity with the people of Olongapo City as they pay respect and honor the late Mayor James L. Gordon. We seek to declare that January 17 of every year be declared a special non-working holiday in Olongapo City as James Leonard Tagle Gordon Day. Salamat po, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I would have wanted to take this up right away, but the problem is it's a bill of local application. Therefore, we will have to suspend consideration and await the House version, Mr. President. Await for the House version. So I move to suspend consideration of Senate Joint Resolution number 6.
Any objection here and so suspended.
Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1233 under Committee Report number 8.
Any objection? The hearing on consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, this is the measure on creating the Coconut Farmers and Industry Trust Fund. The parliamentary status of the measure is that we are still in the period of interpellations. So may we then recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Agriculture and Food, Senator Francis Pangilinan, and to interpolate, Senator Cynthia Villar.
Senator Pangilinan, the Chair of the Committee on Agriculture and sponsor of the measure, is recognized during the period of interpellation. Senator Cynthia Villar is recognized at the period of interpellation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the good sponsor yield for some question, comments, and suggestions?
Willingly, Mr. Chairperson, Madam Chair, Mr. Senate President, to the good senator from Las Piñas.
Okay. The first issue which I want to tackle is the investment of the fund. Okay. Pag ikaw investor, there are two choices open to you. You take a lot of risk and earn more, or you take little risk but you preserve the fund or the capital. So I just want to question if the good sponsor will agree with me that we should limit the investment of funds to treasury bills. It might give us low return on investment, but the fund will last our lifetime and even beyond our lifetime. The coconut farmers waited so long for this fund, and I think their wish is that we should preserve the capital at all costs. So, because in the bill, you're suggesting that we employ a fund manager and we invest it in many different kinds of investment to earn a better yield for the fund. But I would suggest that we just limit it to treasury bills, and even if we earn less, but we will make sure that the fund is invested and it will last more than our lifetime.
Thank you for the question, Madam, Mr. Senate President, Madam Chairperson. Indeed, this is a matter that we had been grappling with, not only when we became chairman of the Senate Committee on Agriculture, and we were hearing this measure, but also when we were chairman of the Philippine Coconut Authority as a member of the, as presidential advisor on food security. While it is true that we would like to, and we agree, that we would like to ensure that this fund is preserved and that it is made a perpetual fund so that generations of coconut farmers will benefit from the said fund, which at this point the cash component is something like 76 billion pesos, and if we include the non-cash assets, that would be a little over, perhaps the total would be more than 100 billion pesos worth of cash and assets. So malaking pondo po yan, and indeed we would like to preserve the fund. We do not want the fund to be dissipated. We do not want the fund to be abused. There has to be safeguards in terms of the investments, and as proposed by Senator Villar, that we focus on treasury.
We just invest it purely on treasury bills.
Yes. When we did the math, and we would like to place this on record, we are open to such a proposal. We would just like to address how do we avoid that the fund is actually diminished, and because of, for example, the kicking in of inflation, among other things. If it is treasury bills that we are to invest the fund in and limiting it to treasury bills, the rate, as I understand, of treasury bonds would be 3.977%. Now, to do the math, with a 75 billion peso initial trust principal, gross interest is at 2.982 billion pesos. That is at 3.977% per annum. We must lessen, which is government practice, 20% withholding tax and a minimal management fee. So the 2.982 billion pesos annual income from treasury bonds, less 20% withholding tax and a certain management fee, we will be left with 2.383 billion pesos income annually for the 75 billion pesos. Now, this 2.383 billion pesos is the amount that can be used to fund programs and projects for our coconut farmers and the development of the industry. This presupposes, of course, that we are only using the principal.
The interest. The interest.
I mean, sorry, the interest income of the principal, the interest income. But if we factor in inflation, annual inflation, which is 2.3%, thereabouts, so we will have the 2.383 billion pesos will now suffer inflation of 2.3% annually, and 2.3% annually comes to the equivalent of 1.725 billion pesos of the 75 billion pesos. Now, if we wish to preserve the value of the trust fund, then we have to flow back to the trust fund the value of the amount lost due to inflation, which is 1.725 billion, which will, well, strictly speaking, matitira na lang po actually 658 million pesos in real aggregate terms. Kaya po, iniisip po natin, if we limit it to treasury bonds, ganun na lang po ang real, well, including inflation, mababawasan. So magiging 658 million pesos to fund productivity and livelihood projects. So yun ho, ang medyo dilemma po natin. But we are open to perhaps, if the good senator is willing, maybe we can find a middle ground somewhere. Apart from treasury bills, perhaps we can look at, for example, the investments made by GSIS or SSS, which are not limited to treasury bonds. Since GSIS is also a government corporation, then perhaps we can have some flexibility. But of course, this is something that we may have to, how do you call it, share with and perhaps get a compromise or a middle ground with the good senator on the proposal.
Mr. Sponsor and Mr. President, usually we have experience with, you suggested the fund managers, fund manager to handle the fund. I have very long experience with fund managers and investment in equities. So I wouldn't want that the fund will go to those kind of investments because I didn't have very good experience with this kind of things. So I thought that in the bill or in the law we're going to pass, we should indicate where we want to invest the funds, because we don't leave it to the different fund managers or different people, because as I've said, this fund will last us more than our lifetime. We will not always be here to watch over or do oversight over the funds. So we would want an investment that it's not in their discretion, but it's something that's very safe, so that even if we don't earn a lot, but we make sure that the fund is always there and it will earn interest wherein we can do projects for the coconut farmers. Anyway, we should not work for a big amount, because as I will indicate later on, I would like to include in the bill an additional provision that we will require that the government will provide for the Philippine Coconut Authority to do some of the work for the coconut farmer. It's not indicated in the bill. We did not mention yung ating PCA. Alam nyo, yung ating Coco Levy Fund should be in addition to what the government should do for the coconut farmers. It should not be in lieu of what they should do. So I would like to include in the bill a provision, maybe in the miscellaneous provision, that we will require the government to provide a budget for the PCA every year of not less than 5 billion pesos a year. Because from our experience, bigla nilang binababa yung budget for PCA. Before, it was 4 billion, suddenly they made it 1.3 billion. If the government should do that, then yung lahat ng kikitain ng COCO levy fund will just compensate for the decrease in budget of PCA. We should write a bill that there is income from the COCO levy fund, and we should list down the projects we will do with the COCO levy fund, and then we insert a provision that the government should provide for the Philippine Coconut Authority 5 billion pesos a year, and then minimum. There's no maximum because it can go up, but that's the minimum. And then we enumerate what the PCA will do for the coconut farmers and what the COCO levy fund should do for the coconut farmers. Yung ating pong, I would suggest that yung budget ng PCA will provide for infrastructure, maybe 20% of the budget, for planting, replanting, fertilization, and development of seedling nurseries, about 15% of the budget, shared facilities program, 18% of the budget, the Kaani program, 12% of the budget, pest management, 5% of the budget, agribusiness and marketing, 5% of the budget, research and development, 5% of the budget, and operations and regulations, 20% of the budget. We should enumerate so that this PCA will always follow our guidelines so that you make sure that they do projects for the coconut farmers every year. And then we list down what we will do with the COCO levy funds. Because when I was chairman of the Committee on Agriculture and Food, we had hearings all over the country. And we asked the coconut farmers, what do they want out of the COCO levy funds? And they enumerated something like this: socialized credit, shared facilities program for their health, benefit, educational benefit, and livelihood, and development of co-ops and farmers organization. So if our good sponsor will accept our suggestions, I would like the bill to include these enumerations of what we should do about the money, about the COCO levy fund, and about PCA, so that we make sure that they spend the money on the right things rather than putting them in their discretion. So we have done this before in many of our laws that we have passed, and we're getting good results. So I thought that if the good sponsor will accept our suggestion, maybe we can compromise. I really don't like our fund to go to equities. That's too risky. Maybe we could define the fixed income investment, which we can do. If you don't agree with me that we should do pure treasury bills, and then we enumerate where the money will go, and then we make a provision that the budget of the Philippine Coconut Authority will not go down below 5 billion pesos a year. And we enumerate what they're going to do with that budget to make sure that we are able to bring our coconut farmers, who are the poorest in this country, earning on the average 50 pesos a day or 1,500 a month, that we will have finally a solution to bring them out of poverty. So yun lang po ang request ko sa inyo, and maybe we can discuss this in the period of amendments.
Yes, ma'am. Madam Chairperson, Mr. Senate President, we'd like to thank Senator Villar for her proposed amendments and the principles behind why she wishes to have these amendments included. We agree, Mr. President, that in principle, the budgetary appropriations for the PCA must be separate, and the fund in itself, the COCO levy fund, should not should be on top of in terms of the interest income, should be on top of the budget already appropriated. Hindi ho dapat babawasan yung pondo ng PCA, halimbawa sa General Appropriations Measure, dahil idadahilan po nila na nariyan na naman yung COCO levy fund. We agree. Subject to style, and also I think provided we can harmonize the proposed the proposed amendment with respect to, for example, the constitutional provision that a bill should only embrace one subject, which shall be expressed in the title thereof, which is the constitutional provision. I have no problem with that particular proposed amendment. Second, with respect to limiting the investments, also we agree in principle. We do not want to see the fund dissipated. We do not want to see a repeat of government investments that go wrong to the detriment of the coconut farmers. In fact, the proposed measure has identified what investments are not allowed, but we are more than willing to include
To be definite.
and then to spell out precisely what the limitations are. And sabi nga po nila, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We'd like to see the proposed amendments. Perhaps we can craft it together so that we can accommodate the same during the committee, during the period of amendments, Madam Chairperson, Mr. Senate President.
Mr. President, Mr. Sponsor, I don't like to use as an example the success of SSS and GSIS. I don't think they're successful in their investment. So we must think of ways that our COCO levy fund will be more successful than GSIS and SSS. They're not. The mere fact that they only give 1,200 pension for those who have worked for 10 years and 2,400 for those who have worked for 20 years is not an indication that they are very good to their members. And we want to be very nice to our cocoa farmers because they are the poorest in our country. They need our help very much, and we should make this bill as perfect as possible so that we make sure that with this bill, we bring them out of poverty. Yun lang po. Marami pong salamat, Mr. Sponsor, and marami pong salamat, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Villar.
Thank you, Mr.
Is there any other colleague of ours who would avail of the period of interpellation? Senator Villanueva?
We'd like to thank Senator Villar for her inputs, and we look forward to putting together the proposed amendments and have them accommodated during the period of amendments, Mr. President.
Mr. President, may I ask that Senator Joel Villanueva be recognized for the continuing interpellation?
Senator Villanueva is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Majority Floor Leader. Thank you, Mr. President. With the distinguished gentleman, I yield to some questions.
Willingly, Mr. President, to the testament.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, distinguished colleague. I was listening attentively with the questions raised by the distinguished lady from Las Piñas, and I would also agree with the statements made by the sponsor to not only come up with the prohibitions on the following investments as stated in the committee report. Please allow me, Mr. President, to just focus on the specific job generation component of this particular measure, in as much as this bill seeks to compensate farmers who were previously entitled to the benefits of the COCO levy funds. I believe we should be more proactive as to the current state of our coconut farmers' livelihood as well. Mr. President, the Department of Agriculture is the lead agency of the Agricultural Training Institute, or ATI, to institutionalize farming programs and prepare for an integrated plan for publicly funded training programs in agriculture and fisheries pursuant to Republic Act number 8435, or the Agriculture and Fisheries Modernization Act of 1997. Mr. President, recently the ATI has begun coordinating with other government agencies like the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority and the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry to enhance the competencies of our farmers, and especially the youth, by instituting training programs in Diliman, Quezon City. May I ask and pose this question to the distinguished gentleman, the sponsor of the measure, if the bill contain a provision for institutionalizing training programs for coconut farmers in order to encourage more of them to engage in coconut farming as well as enhance their capacity to do so.
Yes, Mr. President, a specific provision is not made available in the law itself, but there is a provision in the proposed bill, rather, that requires for the submission, the crafting of a coconut development, coconut industry roadmap, to be approved by the President, actually. In other words, without this coconut industry development plan, the funds cannot be released. And part of the plan precisely is to build the capacity of our coconut farmers. As earlier mentioned by Senator Villar, 50 pesos a day ang average income ng ating coconut farmers. 80% of our coconut farms are actually monocrop. Talagang nyog lang ang kanilang pinagkakakitaan. Tapos kalahati pa nung mga lupain ng coconut farms ay nutrient deficient. Ibig sabihin po nung nutrient deficient, hindi ho siya na-fertilize kaya mababa ho ang yield. In fact, may datos po na nagpapatunay na pagkatama ang fertilization ng isang puno ng nyog, after 2 years, dodoble ang kanyang yield ng bawat puno. Pero dahil nga po dito, talagang ang kapasidad ng ating mga coconut farmers napakababa. At dahil dito, mababa din ang kanilang kinikita. There was an opportunity, Mr. President, when we were still Cabinet Secretary for Food Security, Presidential Advisor, we visited a cocoa coir processing enterprise in Bislig. And the women, the wives of the coconut farmers, were into cocoa coir development. They had the decorticating machine. They were taught their capacity. They were built. Their skills were improved through training, and because of that particular building of capacity and training, they were earning 400 pesos a week minimum because of cocoa coir processing. And dahil po rito, times 3, bigla ho silang kumikita ng additional 1,200 to almost 3,000 a month. Suddenly, meron na silang pambili ng kape, pambili ng bigas, pambaon para sa kanilang mga anak dahil lang nadagdagan ng kanilang kapasidad na hindi lamang kopra ang produkto nung kanilang nyog, pati yung cocoa coir. And interesting enough, there was a synergy in terms of COCOQUAR requirements because the Department of Public Works and Highways purchased COCOQUAR for the embankments of their projects, road projects, yung mga para hindi ho nagkakaroon ng erosion ng soil, sa halip na semento ang ginagawa para protektahan yung embankment, ang ginagamit po nila COCOQUAR, 30% less ang presyo, tapos environmentally sound pa and sustainable. So, tama po yun. Kinakailangan po ng capacity building dahil marami pa hong value adding na gagawin sa produkto ng pagnunyog, yung virgin coconut oil, kinakailangan ng training dyan, yung coco peat production, kailangan din ng training dyan. Kung ito po ay coco sugar, kailangan din po ng building of capacity. So lahat ho nitong value adding na kinakailangan gawin dahil yan ang susi para tumaas ang kita ng ating mga magnunyog, kailangan po ng training. So critical po ang component ng skills development and training para sa ating mga magnunyog.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, distinguished colleague. I think both of us agree of the importance of building capacity and training. I just remember, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, during our time when you were in the Department of Agriculture and this representation is with TESDA, there is somehow a, I don't want to call it overlapping, but somehow yung, baka ho kasi may unnecessary overlapping or redundancy in terms of efforts of any government agency in capacitating and strengthening the livelihood of our coconut farmers. That is why I thought this is a great opportunity for me to raise this particular issue. For example, Mr. President, yung pong ginagawa ng ATI o yung Agricultural Training Institute at yung ginagawa rin po ng TESDA, considering there are agricultural courses, training regulations, specifically for our coconut farmers. I think there's no question doon sa importance ng pagbibigay ng training, capacity building measures, and I think ang importante lang, at gusto ko pong i-raise itong pagkakataon nito, na magkaroon ng mas malinaw na programa, and that was my question nga kanina, if indeed this particular measure that we are deliberating upon would have some sort of mechanism to place this particular initiative that we are proposing.
We may also put in place perhaps a criteria as to who should be part of the crafting of the development plan of the coconut industry,
That's a
and
good-
therefore to prevent the overlapping, TESDA should be part of that interagency committee tasked to put together and craft the coconut industry development plan.
I agree, Mr. President, distinguished colleague. They can be invited. But can I also ask one question? If you look at the percentage of the fund that will be used for capacity building, do we have a ballpark figure or a certain percentage that will go to this funding?
We did not delve into the details, Mr. President. We believe that the development plan will be put together within a timetable by the executive department, and then approved by the President. So we are leaving it to the Trust Fund Committee to look into this matter and ensure that a portion of the appropriations or the budgetary support will go to training and capacity building.
With the current number of coconut farmers, would you give us a how
Well-
many would be into it, and perhaps if the distinguished gentleman would have a data as to how many would actually be part of this capacity building? Siguro pag-usapan na rin yung per
Yes.
capita, Mr. President.
Well, right now, Mr. President, the data we have is obviously not many are capacitated because the average income is still 15,000 pesos a year on COPRA. So, maliit pa rin ang porsyento ng merong capacity para madagdagan ang kanilang kita sa pamamagitan ng value adding of their products.
Thank you, Mr. President. On another note, Mr. President, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has spearheaded efforts to coordinate with the Philippine Coconut Authority, DAR, DNR, in restoring the livelihood of coconut farmers who were adversely affected by typhoons dating back to 2013. These include introducing coconut farmers in regions 6 and 8 to new technologies in coconut farming, as well as enabling them to plant other crops such as vegetables alongside their main crops of coconut. In fact, Mr. President, in Mindoro, the UNFAO established 68 climate smart farmer field schools, which taught coconut farmers to make use of updating the coconut farmers' methods of farming to more ecologically balanced practices. I am citing these initiatives, Mr. President, because these are examples of engagements of coconut farmers undertaken by non-government organizations in empowering our coconut farmers. May I know, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, if there is a provision in the bill that provides a particular or a framework or a mechanism that will facilitate efforts by non-governmental organizations and their respective sources of funding towards assisting the coconut farmers and encouraging them to continue growing coconuts.
We see the importance of actually getting public sector, private sector,
Engaged.
non-government organizations sector mobilized around building capacity and providing support for training for credit of these farmers' enterprises or farmers' organizations. Perhaps at the proper time, if there are proposed amendments, we would be more than willing to accept. What is critical really is government alone will not be able to really provide the necessary sustained effort at moving our farmers, coconut farmers, from subsistence farming,
Yes.
where they are now, to become farm enterprise partners or farm enterprise players. What we really have to do is to transform our farming communities from subsistence farming, which is the norm, to farm enterprise management and development, which is the way forward. And that will require precisely the academe, the non-government organizations, private sector, government, hand in hand, mobilizing resources and support for our farmers organizations and farming communities.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, especially for being open and at the proper time. We'd like to introduce some amendments. Mr. President, does the bill allow, or would the good sponsor be amenable also to including a provision, as I mentioned earlier, that allows the coconut farmers to be provided with additional crops that can be planted when their coconut crops are affected by weather or other environmental limitations?
Yes, Mr. President, the bill itself provides for intercropping, for example, as part of the plan, the national plan, development plan for the coconut industry. Coconut productivity, including intercropping, livestock raising, community-based coconut enterprises, including integrated processing of coconut products and downstream products, coconut farmers organization and development, among others, Mr. President.
I'm glad that the distinguished sponsor mentioned some of the yung pong ibang alternative options para sa ating mga coconut farmers. Isang punto na lang po, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, as of 2014, the Philippine Coconut Authority has stated that there are some 3.5 million coconut farmers in the Philippines. And over 26% of our country's agricultural land is devoted to planting of coconuts. In the labor market intelligence reports as of 2013, coconut farming remains an in-demand occupation in the field of agribusiness. Mr. President, do we have the latest, and if the distinguished gentleman would give us an update or updated information from the Philippine Coconut Authority as to the latest number of coconut farmers presently engaged in their respective livelihood?
Ganun pa rin, di ba? Well, the data that you provided, Mr. President, is the same data that was provided to committee. 3.5 million coconut farmers, 26% of the country's population are directly benefiting from the industry. It is a poor constituency. The coconut farmers, the poorest farmers actually are coconut farmers. They earn less than rice farmers or sugarcane farmers or even vegetable farmers. So kinakailangan talagang bigyan ng suporta po sila.
If I may, Mr. President, as of now, is coconut farming still considered an in-demand occupation?
Well,
in the latest
yes.
labor market intelligence
Mr.
report?
President, that's the irony. Coconut oil, we are the #1 exporters of desiccated coconut oil in the entire planet. And in the last 5 years, that has, among other products, but the bulk is the coconut oil, has brought in $1.5 billion worth of exports to the country in the last 5 years. The largest, actually, dollar earner for agriculture is the coconut industry. So that's the irony. Plus, there is a exponential growth surge in terms of demand for other coconut products such as virgin coconut oil. So the irony is, yes, it is a top dollar earner, yet our farmers are simply producers of raw material. They do not do value adding. They do not do enterprise management and development, kaya napakababa. In fact, ang benta nila ng kanilang nyog, anywhere between 3 to 5 pesos, halimbawa kung buko, pero pagdating sa merkado, it's already 25 pesos. And then pag ibebenta pa sa restaurant, magiging 100 pesos na yung isang buko. So ang laki nung incremental increase in terms of value adding, pero ang hindi kumikita ay yung farmer.
Coconut farmers. And it is clear to me, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, na meron pa ring demand, mataas pa rin yung demand. Unfortunately, looks like hindi naaalagaan ng gusto itong mga coconut farmers.
Hindi nabibigyan ng suporta in terms of access to the markets, hindi nabibigyan ng suporta in terms of being organized, dahil ang average farm size sa ating bansa is only 1.5 hectares. That in itself, wala hong economies of scale. Pag ikaw ay 1.5 hectares, 1 hectare na lamang po ng coconut, sabi nila, you will have around 100 trees. Sabihin na po natin. And at 40 nuts per tree per year. So medyo kung 1.5 hectares lang ang lupa mo, talagang yung mga coconut traders ang makikinabang. Ako ho, sabi ko nga po, nung meron po akong less than 3 hectares, nakapagbabaho ako halimbawa ng 100 buko. Diyan po sa Alfonso, Cavite. Binibili sa amin ng 5 piso ng middleman. Hindi na kami aakyat ng puno, sila nang aakyat. So, 5 pesos yung isang buko. Pero pagdating dito sa Maynila, 25 pesos na ang benta. Wala pa hong 2 oras ang biyahe. Pero kung isang traka lang, ng 100 nyog, gagastos ka ng toll, gagastos ka ng gasolina, kasi nga, isang 1.5 hectares lang ang lupa mo, talagang malulugi ka. Pero kung 10 kayo, kung 15 kayong farmers, meron kayong 30 hektarya, aggregate, iisa lang ang truck ninyo, lahat kayo papatong-patong, you will share with the expense of gasoline and transportation, including maintenance kung organized kayo, mas may economies of scale, mas gaganda ang kita ng farmer at hindi yung middleman na siya ang nag-aggregate at consolidate. So napakahalaga ng training, in fact, organizing and capacity building to be able to run and manage an enterprise is also part of the, should be part of the plan. So that they, again, as I said earlier, they will graduate from subsistence farming, isang kahig, isang tuka, to farm enterprise management.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, distinguished colleague. Siguro sasabihin ko na lang po, napaka-unfortunate lang na yung binanggit nyo nga po na ang taas ng demand, ang daming pupwedeng gawin para mag-improve ang buhay ng ating mga coconut farmers, but unfortunately, hindi pa rin ito mangyari, and I'm hoping and praying that this particular measure would help our coconut farmers. And again, I'm still hoping, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, that we'll be able to help them through this measure, ensure also that the current demand for coconut farmers will be met, either through job skills matching, enhancement of training and empowerment of coconut farmers, and even their respective families, Mr. President, distinguished colleague. I would end my interpellation on that note, and again, Mr. President, thank you for the distinguished gentleman, the chairperson of the Committee on Agriculture, and at the proper time, this representation would introduce some amendments. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'd like to thank Senator Villanueva for his interpellation. Maraming salamat po.
Majority Leader.
Suspend na muna.
Thank you, Mr. President. There are still a number of members who wish to interpolate the bill, so I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1233.
Any objection? Hearing none, consideration of Senate Bill number 1233 is hereby suspended.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the permission of the Chamber, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1277 under Committee Report number 19.
Any objection? Hearing none, in order.
This is the measure on free internet access program. The parliamentary status of the measure is that we're still in the period of interpellation. So may we then recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Science and Technology, Senator Bam Aquino, and to interpellate the Minority Leader, Senator Ralph Recto.
The gentlemen are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader. Would the distinguished sponsor and chairman of the Committee on Science and Technology yield to a few questions?
Yes, Mr. President, and for the record, we'd like to state that the good Minority Leader actually spearheaded this provision a number of years ago, and we'd like to thank him for his leadership on the matter.
Thank you for the kind remarks, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I'd like to thank the distinguished sponsor for coming out with the committee report on this program. At the same time, to commend the gentleman also for the committee report.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you
President.
for such an important bill. Mr. President, the purpose of my interpellation, considering that I know the history of this bill and the budget that we put in the budget, Congress in the Senate, particularly in 2015, we put $3 billion in the budget in 2015 to start this free Wi-Fi project in the country. I'd like to, the purpose of my interpellation is, considering the history of this, is to improve the capability of the DICT to implement the program. No? The same time to address existing bottlenecks, to find out the problems encountered in the program's implementation, achieve the goals of the program, put in place strengthen existing regulatory provisions to fast-track and improve the program's implementation and ensure its funding, Mr. President. No? So let me begin, Mr. President. Considering that we've had this since 2015, what were the challenges faced by the DOST then, the DICT today, in the program's implementation since 2015, when we first appropriated the budget for the free public Wi-Fi program?
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. President. That was the main subject matter of our hearings on this. Surprisingly, Mr. President, it's not money because there was money allocated by government. Primarily, it was, according to them, the permits needed by the telcos in putting up the needed infrastructure to support the move to have free Wi-Fi in all of these areas, Mr. President. So when they would go to an area, choose it as a pilot area for the free Wi-Fi, they would find that infrastructure was sorely lacking in many areas. And one of the reasons for this was the permitting needed by the telcos to set up new infrastructure to support this program, Mr. President. The other one was that in some areas, they didn't find any bidders. Because it seemed that there was a lack of bidders in a number of the areas they had chosen. So in those areas, Mr. President, without any bidders, you would have no implementation.
So clearly, one of the problems here, or part of the strategy to implement this program, is a partnership between the government and the private sector.
Well, Mr. President, through our hearings, that evolved, no? So primarily, it was a partnership, and the idea was we can piggyback on the current and existing infrastructure of our private sector partners. Eventually, the idea of putting up a national broadband was raised by the DICT, and that's currently being deliberated by them. And as of the last hearing, Mr. President, the last idea that they wanted to push forth was in some areas they would piggyback and they would partner with the private sector. In other areas, government would set up its own to extend the network further to areas where our private sector partners are not present. So the on-the-ground experiences, Mr. President, led to the National Broadband Plan, led to identifying what areas our private telcos are not present in. And right now, it's a hybrid solution, Mr. President, that they wish to do.
Okay. So what is the new strategy today for them to be able to accomplish?
Mr. President, this is just subject of our
objectives of
hearings,
the
no?
program, yes.
They have yet to finalize the National Broadband Plan. If I'm not mistaken, they're still waiting for the approval of the President on the matter. But in our last hearing, they had said that they are looking at a hybrid broadband network where DICT will utilize existing private sector infrastructure where possible, and in other areas, support the establishment of new infrastructure by the private sector, or even if these areas are areas where the private sector is not looking at expanding in, to even for government to invest in infrastructure in these areas. And we're talking about the fiber optic cables, linking to cell sites, Mr. President, and hopefully that hybrid plan can cover the whole country, Mr. President.
Okay. So that will be a new strategy, is that so?
Yes, Mr. President, in the sense that they are thinking of putting up a national broadband plan.
Yeah. Is there anything in the bill that talks about this?
Mr. President, it's not in the committee report, Mr. President, any reference to the national broadband plan. But we may include it. In fact, Mr. President, we are thinking of including Section 8 of your bill, and this is on public-private participation. We can include a provision, Mr. President, that highlights that or even refers to the National Broadband Plan, Mr. President.
Okay, so maybe at the appropriate time. Now, when you say a hybrid plan, what does that mean?
Mr. President, during the hearing, they
Yung
presented...
broadband, are you talking about government investing in the upstream, the downstream,
Yes,
midstream?
they presented 3 plans, Mr. President. One was completely government-owned, and this would mean all the facilities, all the interconnections are owned by government. And the pros and cons here are that it's a more secure network. Other countries have a similar network because of concerns on defense, independence from the private sector. But the main con here, Mr. President, is that it's expensive and it will take time to put up, no? The other extreme is to completely be on the private sector infrastructure, Mr. President, which I think in 2015 was more or less where we were. The issue here, Mr. President, the good thing is that it will be cheaper. The bad thing is that we're dependent on the expansion of the private sector. So the third idea, Mr. President, which they are leaning towards but not yet finalized, is a hybrid plan, where in areas where the private sector is robust, we will utilize that structure, but in areas where the private sector is unable to provide services, that government will invest in all the facilities needed to expand the network to areas outside of the usual urban centers, Mr. President.
So, sa madaling salita, Mr. President, hindi pa alam ng gobyerno kung anong gagawin nila.
Mr. President, they're in the midst of finalizing.
Okay. So why should we pass the bill kung hindi pa maliwanag on the part of the government what they intend to do so that we can craft the bill properly?
Well, Mr. President, there might be a need for a national broadband plan bill eventually, no? But I think the bill in its current state merely talks about the end result, which are that we want to see free Wi-Fi in the designated public places. How to achieve that, Mr. President, we left it to DICT. However, you're right, if it needs a national broadband plan or it needs further allocation in the GAA, that can be done. But primarily, the bill and the version submitted by many of our colleagues merely point to the end result, which is that we want to see free Wi-Fi in multiple public places in the Philippines. How that is done is still subject to discussion, Mr. President, and probably funding requirements on our end.
So hindi kompleto yung bill. as far
In
as
that
is
sense,
concerned.
Mr. President, it could backward integrate further, no? But again, the bill is merely a statement of principle that we want to see this free Wi-Fi in these named public places in the bill, Mr. President.
Is it possible, Mr. Sponsor, to include in the bill certain regulatory provisions to help fast-track and improve the program's implementation?
Yes, Mr. President. In fact, one of the sections, Section 6 actually talks about fast-track permitting with regard to the local government units and national government agencies. We can amend this section, Mr. President, and add other aspects which may ease the rollout of this program further.
No. I was talking about regulatory in terms of regulating the telecommunication sector or making it easier for private sector to invest in the internet and provide internet services together with government.
We're open to that, Mr. President.
Okay. So, because I suppose that many of the issues here are also regulatory in nature.
Well, Mr.
Strengthening
President,
the NTC, for example.
Mr.
That could be-
President,
that could be
this
done
is a
in this bill.
government program.
Yeah.
So the idea here is that there should be less regulation required of this rollout because it is a priority government program. But of course, Mr. President, we're very happy to include that if the good gentleman would want to include these provisions down the line.
Meaning to say, how many sites do we want to have, how many sites in the country are we looking at to have free public Wi-Fi?
10 years? For this year. 12,481 public Wi-Fi powered public places for this year, but in a 10-year plan, over 100,000 areas, Mr.
So
President.
basically, it's 100,000
Over 10 years, Mr.
over
President.
10 years, di ba?
Yes.
Okay. And the cost of that is how much? What, 30 billion?
30 billion, Mr. President.
So 300,000 per site,
Roughly, Mr. President.
roughly. Okay. And considering the magnitude of this, there might be a need to amend certain provisions in the Telecommunications Act.
Yes, Mr. President.
Because the purpose of this bill is to provide free public Wi-Fi in public places. And we've identified more or less 100,000 sites.
Yes, Mr. President.
Diba? And you will need private sector participation.
Definitely, Mr. President.
So, if, for example, one example, if you're providing internet service in the last mile, kailangan pa ba ng congressional franchise yun?
Mr. President, currently, and this is from NTC, Mr. President, no? The internet is classified as a value-added service, and therefore, it does not need to secure its own franchise. If it is just merely internet providers. So no, Mr. President, they don't need a franchise.
They don't need a franchise
For the last mile, Mr.
for the
President.
last mile. Okay. So anyone can put up
Yes, Mr.
an
President.
internet in the last mile.
Yes, Mr. President, as a provider.
Okay. What about providing minimum standards?
Yes, Mr. President, actually, DICT does have minimum standards.
For download speed, upload speed,
Mr. President, DICT will be submitting the minimum speed, et cetera, as further suggestions to improve the bill. So it's not currently in the bill, but they do want to put together some guidelines on standards, which we will be introducing later on in the committee amendment.
How do we encourage private sector participation to promote an efficient and cost-effective delivery of free internet service, especially for these non-viable areas, Mr. President? Is there anything found in the bill as far as this is concerned?
Well, Mr. President, I think the best come-on for them is really the fast-tracking of the permits. Because time and again, Mr. President, during the hearings, this seems to be a large concern from the telcos in terms of improving their infrastructure. One of the telcos, Mr. President, was saying that they had budget for 3,000 cell sites for 2015, but were only able to put up 1,000 because of issues in terms of permitting and ease of doing business. So if we're able, Mr. President, through this act, to really open up, make it easy for them to roll out. Anyway, all local government units are public places, no? All public parks, and all municipalities would include city halls and public schools. I think, Mr. President, that's a huge come-on for them to really match the effort of government, which we've shown through our funding, by putting up the infrastructure also at the same pace. So I would think, Mr. President, the biggest come-on for them is if they join the program, they will have an easier time to put up infrastructure in the Philippines.
I will get to that in a bit later, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President.
But I was really actually referring to a provision that I had in my original bill, which encourages, or maybe we can mandate the private sector or the private service providers to exchange data traffic at a domestic internet protocol exchange designated by the DICT. Wouldn't that improve the speed?
Yes, Mr.
Internet
President,
service?
that is a great idea to put into law. In practice, Mr. President, the big telcos and the ICT are already exchanging information, but this might be an opportunity to put that into law as well, Mr. President.
So we could include that in
Yes.
the free public Wi-Fi bill.
Yes, Mr.
So that's an example of one regulatory issue as well
Yes.
that strengthens the government, right? Okay. Mr. President, the next item is, should we adopt a time frame? My bill originally had 2 years as a time frame. I've seen, based on the submission of the DICT, that they have a 10-year development plan, supposed to be. Shouldn't we put a provision that within a specified time frame?
Yes, Mr. President, that was the subject of Senator De Lima's interpellation as well, putting a time frame through this bill, and we would be very happy to receive your comments and suggestions alongside Senator De Lima on that topic. It is not current in the current committee report, but we will be happy to add it, Mr. President.
Minimum siguro in 10 years, because that's already a submission by the DICT.
Maybe,
Or rather,
Mr. President.
maximum na.
Yes, Mr. President. Maybe even a yearly schedule might be needed.
Okay. Now, going to section 6 of the committee report, permitting and certification. It says here that the DICT shall standardize and regulate fees for the facilitation of permits, certificates, and the rental rates of government-owned or controlled properties for the construction of infrastructure and installation of equipment necessary for the immediate effective implementation of the program. Why not specify in the bill itself what the permitting and certification process should be?
Mr. President, we would be happy to include that as an amendment down the line.
Liwanagin na natin. Let them do their work right now.
All right.
Let them talk to the LGs already and make it specific in the bill.
All right, Mr. President, we'd be very happy to include that.
And to ensure that all the taxes and permits to be paid
Are clear.
go to the local government units para walang away.
Yes, Mr. President.
Diba? That might be the solution, Mr. President. Since, as you mentioned, that is one of the biggest issues.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay? Mr. Chairman, Senate Bill 816 had a free and fair usage policy, which was not adopted in the substitute bill, in the committee report. Shouldn't we include a provision on free and fair usage policy?
Actually, Mr. President, DICT was also intending to include a provision on this or something similar, and we were intending to accommodate that in an amendment. So we would be happy, Mr. President, if you would, if you feel we can adopt Section 5 of your bill, then we would be happy to reinstate it.
Thank you, Mr. President. On one of the most important features of the bill, the appropriations clause, Mr. President, why not create a trust fund also from the spectrum user fees, so that there is clear funding for the program?
Yes, Mr. President. The ICT also mentioned to me that they are very favorable to that, and we can include it.
Okay. And how much is collected yearly by the NTC?
2.5 billion, Mr. President.
So where does that
average.
money go today?
It goes to the Treasury, Mr. President.
Okay. And it came from the telecommunication sector, by and large.
Yes.
So from consumers.
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
there is no reason why we should not use this fund for the free public Wi-Fi as well.
We may, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you for that. But that's all for now, Mr. President. But I thank again the sponsor of the measure. And just to do a recap, at the appropriate time, we will introduce these amendments. And I'd like to take this opportunity for the DICT to start consulting with the local government units so that we can put in the bill itself ano na yung talagang policy in permitting.
They're nodding their heads, Mr. President, indicating affirmative.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President.
And Mr. President, for the
Chairman of
record,
the committee, thank you.
For the record, Mr. President, we would like to thank the Minority Floor Leader for his questions. It's always a pleasure to answer questions for the Minority Floor Leader, especially on this topic where he has done so much work in the past. Thank you very much, Mr. Minority Floor Leader.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, before there are other members who wish to interpolate, but before we suspend consideration, may I be allowed to ask one or two questions for my clarification, Mr. President?
The Majority Leader is recognized on the period of
Yeah.
interpolation.
Yes,
Thank
Mr.
you,
President.
Thank you very much, the distinguished gentleman from Tarlac and Quezon City. You mentioned earlier in your conversation with the Minority Leader about the probability of a piggyback on the private sector on this internet access program.
Yes, Mr. President.
Something to that effect.
Partnership, piggyback.
Yes. Were you pertaining to the telcos?
Yes, Mr. President.
All right, so that means that we will be accessing not only the broadband or hybrid plan, but you'll be accessing the cell sites
Yes, Mr.
of the
President.
telcos. No?
Mr. President,
So when we go through the internet, we basically use the cell sites of the telcos.
Yes, Mr. President.
Is that
Mr. President, and if I may clarify, we're
Oo.
paying for it. It's not for free, Mr. President. Nagbabayad tayo for this. So we are paying, we will be paying them for the usage of their network and for the internet, Mr. President.
All right. Then therefore, my question or my questions are, first, how many cell sites do we have in the Philippines?
20,000 and more, Mr. President. 20,000 and more.
20,000
Around
plus.
20,000 plus, Mr. President.
20,000 plus.
Yes,
And
Mr.
the population of the Philippines is 100 million.
Yes, Mr. President.
Would you know the number of cell sites in Vietnam?
67,000? 67,000, Mr.
How
President.
many? How many?
67,000.
67,000.
And what is the population of Vietnam, Mr. President?
40 million?
Including the Viet Cong.
We're Googling it, Mr. President. Just a second.
Oh, 100 million?
Okay. According to the Minority Floor Leader, Mr. President, about 100 million as well.
No, we're talking about the 67,000 cell sites are only in South Vietnam. So what is the population of South Vietnam, Mr. President?
89 million, Mr. President.
89 million. Okay. For 89 million, they have 67,000 cell sites. While in the Philippines, 100 million, almost everybody has a cell phone or more than 2 or 3 cell phones. And yet we only have 20,000 cell sites.
Yes, Mr. President.
So, will we be successful with this free internet access program? Why don't we ask the telcos to upgrade first?
Mr. President, the chicken and the egg issue, Mr. President, is that we want faster internet, we need more infrastructure. The telcos will say there are so many hindrances to putting up infrastructure. And with this bill, Mr. President, virtually wala nang hindrance because significant provision here is the fast tracking of the permits. And Senator Recto earlier was talking about even clarifying that you don't even need a franchise to be able to do this. So in effect, Mr. President, we're paving the way for them to actually put up these cell sites faster. Wala na pong rason kung ba't di sila makakapagtayo ng cell site. And that's why, Mr. President, with the passage of this bill, it's very clear that there are no more reasons. Because the number one reason in our hearings, Mr. President, is that mabagal daw yung LGU, mabagal daw yung NGA. It takes 30 permits to actually put up a cell site. With this, Mr. President, na fast track na madali pa, and hopefully, there are no more reasons. Wala na pong mga rason na pwedeng ibigay kung ba't
What
di nagtatayo.
about the capital outlay?
Mr. President, my understanding is that they've budgeted for this already. No? One of the telcos in one of our previous hearings, Mr. President, mentioned that they budgeted for 3,000 cell sites, but were only able to implement 1,000 because of the permitting issues. So meaning, Mr. President, there's money that they're willing to spend.
3,000 cell sites is far from the 67 or so thousand of Vietnam.
Yes, Mr. President. So, but even then, Mr. President, they were only able to put up 1,000, which is even less. So we need to be able to unlock all of these issues being raised, Mr. President, so that they can put up these cell sites.
Well, the franchises of the telcos are up
Yes, Mr. President.
here this year, no? Most of them, if not all of them, if I'm not mistaken. Putting up cell sites, you don't need a franchise, but the mother companies need their franchises renewed. Yes.
Yes,
so,
Mr. President.
I was just reminded by, perhaps I should take this up during the time that we tackle the budget of, the franchises of these telecom companies, because I overheard Senator Lacson saying that yung may bayad, nagbabayad tayo, ang bagal eh. Yung magiging libre pa tayo, nakapigi pa tayo doon.
Yes, Mr. President. In fact, Mr. President, it would be good to ask them the schedule of their investment plan for cell sites over the next 10 years, and if this matches the national broadband plan and our free Wi-Fi project, Mr. President. Kasi baka naman ang DICT nakaplano for 100,000 cell sites. Yun pala, yung infrastructure planning nila, kakonti lang, hindi nagmamatch. No? So it should match, Mr. President.
All right. Anyway, Mr. President, as I said, there are a number of members who wish to interpolate, so I have to move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1277 under Committee Report number 19.
All right, thank you very much,
Thank
Mr.
you. We
President.
wish to thank the gentleman, Senator Babak.
So suspended.
Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1239 under Committee Report number 10.
Any objection? Hearing none.
This is the measure strengthening the PNP Criminal Investigation Unit. The parliamentary status of the measure is that we were still in the period of interpellation. So I move to recognize the sponsor, the chairman of the Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs, Senator Pampilo Lacson.
Senator Lacson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe the distinguished minority leader and Senator Crespo have already decided to withdraw from the interpellation.
Yes, I have been informed by the minority leader that most of the questions he wanted were asked already beforehand. So Therefore, I move to end the committee, the period of interpellation, Mr. President, on Senate Bill 1239.
There are no committee amendments, but I believe there are individual amendments, Mr. President.
Yes.
Well, let's
Move
act
to
first on the
suspend.
motion
I'm sorry. Move to
terminate.
end the period of interpellation.
Period for interpellation is hereby terminated.
I move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
Period for committee amendments is in order.
There are no committee amendments, Mr. President. I move to end the period of committee amendments.
Period for committee amendments terminated.
Move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
Period for individual amendments is in order.
Meron?
Suspend na muna.
At this point, Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1239 and the individual amendments will be proposed tomorrow, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of the measure is suspended.
Ralph, where topic? Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1210 under Committee Report Number 4.
Any objection? Hearing none. In order.
This is the measure on the expanded Anti-Wiretapping Act. The parliamentary status of the measure is that we are in the period of interpellation. So I move to recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs, Senator Pampilo Lacson, and to interpellate the Minority Leader, Senator Ralph Recto.
Before we recognize Senator Ralph Recto, the chair wishes to manifest that he wishes to avail of the period of interpellation on this particular measure. Not today, but probably day after tomorrow. Yes, Senator Recto is recognized in the period of interpellation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader. Would the distinguished chairman be willing to answer a few questions on the proposed measure?
Certainly to the distinguished minority leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have a preliminary statement to make. We recognize that it is the bounden duty of the state to promote and maintain public order so that its inhabitants can live in an environment of peace and security. In expanding the powers of the state, like what this bill is proposing, it is necessary to balance the government's duty to protect its citizens with the need to protect civil liberties. Father Joaquin Bernas, a legal luminary in the field of constitutional law, said that invasion of communication and correspondence is a form of search. Hence, the public must be protected against any wanton and unreasonable invasion of communication by the government. In this regard, the constitutional provisions that should serve as guiding beacons in crafting this bill are as follows. Section 2, Article 3, Bill of Rights of the Constitution. Section 2, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures of whatever nature and for any purpose shall be inviolable, and no search warrant or warrant of arrest shall issue except upon probable cause to be determined by the judge after examination under oath or affirmation of the complaint and the witnesses he may produce, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Section 3, paragraph 1 and 2, Article 3, Bill of Rights of the Constitution. Section 3, the privacy of communication and correspondence shall be inviolable, except upon lawful order of the court or when public safety or orders require otherwise as prescribed by law. Paragraph 2, any evidence obtained in violation of this or the preceding section shall be inadmissible for any purpose in any proceeding. With this in mind, Mr. President, allow me to proceed with my questions to the distinguished sponsor. Does the distinguished sponsor know what could be the foremost reason why Republic Act number 4200 was enacted in 1965?
To afford the law enforcement agencies to conduct surveillance and enhance their information gathering, even evidence gathering capability, Mr. President.
That was the reason for Republic Act 4200?
I believe so. One of the reasons anyway, Mr. President.
I think the reason for 4200, Mr. President, because prior to this, there was no law on wiretapping, and it was the practice of private individuals, including corporations and of the state, to wiretap individuals. And that's why it's called the Anti-Wiretapping Act.
If the chair may,
Pinagbawal yung wiretapping.
if the chair may supplement the
Yes.
statement of the minority leader, Mr. Sponsor, in the explanatory note of Senate Bill number 9, which was the basis of the, which became Republic Act 4200, the explanatory note said that the purpose of the law is to prevent wiretapping from being used as an instrument of oppression or arbitrary power. So
Precisely the point, Mr. President.
that is stated in the explanatory note of the Senate bill, which subsequently became Republic Act 4200.
4200.
That is correct, Mr. President, but it cannot also be denied that without the passage of the Anti-Wiretapping Act, the original one, RA 4200, there is no basis for law enforcement agencies to gather information and evidence to be used in court. Because if there's no law allowing or exempting certain offenses from being included in the Anti-Wiretapping Act to be wiretapped by virtue of a court order, then there's no way for law enforcement because all evidence that will be gathered will be rendered unlawful or illegal.
Again, Mr. President, the purpose, if we were to read the transcripts of the debates in 4200, the purpose was to say na bawal ang wiretapping. Now, may exception. The general rule is bawal ang wiretapping.
That is, I agree, Mr. President. As I said, that's one of the reasons. But the primary reason is really to proscribe the act of wiretapping or listening to conversations of private individuals
That is
or
correct.
private conversations.
In fact, even in the United States, Mr. President, nag-umpisa yung anti-wiretapping because, like I said earlier, similar to in the case of the Philippines, private individuals were wiretapping each other, corporations were wiretapping each other,
That is why it's
and
punishable,
the
Mr.
state
President.
was wiretapping its residents, and that's why they enacted such a law na anti-wiretapping. So similar in the case of the Philippines, Mr. President. Now, my next question, Mr. President, is this. Since the enactment of Republic Act 4200, how many amendments have been introduced to the said law?
Only the Human Security Act, by virtue of the passage of the Human Security Act, it became a virtual amendment of RA 4200.
That is correct, Mr. President. And in the case of the Human Security Act of 2007, isn't it? It is only the Court of Appeals also.
That is correct, Mr. President.
Okay. Okay. Later on, we will get to that, Mr. President. Now, what is the real intent now of the amendment of this committee report with regard to 4200?
Following your line of questioning earlier, Mr. President, it is to add safeguards, to increase penalties, and also to expand the coverage of exemptions.
And to make the law, I suppose, more modern today because of the
That is correct,
advances in
Mr.
communications. No? Okay, thank you for that, Mr. President. Could the distinguished sponsor cite any particular case or instance wherein a law enforcement agent formally applied before a court for the issuance of a written authority to wiretap?
This representation, Mr. President, I resorted to applying for a court order way back. I think this was in 1999 or 9, when Secretary Gingona was the Secretary of Justice, Mr. President.
Okay.
We applied for a court order to wiretap at least one individual, Mr. President.
Was the court order issued?
Yes, the court order was issued, and we submitted to the court the proceeds of the wiretap conversations.
Okay. Do you know of any other instance, Mr. President?
I cannot enumerate any other cases where wiretapping was applied for in any court of law, Mr. President.
So you're not familiar with any other instance?
Not that
So
is,
just once?
my only,
Okay. Now,
I only based on my personal experience, Mr.
could we
President.
find out from the law enforcement agencies if there are any other?
They have always been denying, Mr. President, but even, because I don't think they...
Denying or lying, Mr. President?
Denying and lying are one and the same thing, Mr. President.
So why should we trust them with this law if they're not forthright with us, Mr. President? If
No,
they
they're
deny
denying because
and lie
they,
to us,
I don't
Mr.
think they were covered by any court order. That's why they keep on denying that they have the capability even.
So that is
to
even
wiretap.
more alarming, Mr. President, if they're wiretapping without a court order.
That's really alarming. That's why we need to pass this bill. We need to enact this into law so that they will apply. They will be encouraged to apply for court orders because.
I think otherwise, Mr. President, and I will tell you why later on, Mr. President.
Go ahead, Mr. President.
Yes, but let me move on. Isn't it true that during the committee hearing, no one from the government admitted that they have wiretapping device or equipment?
Because that's in effect an admission of guilt in the commission of a crime, Mr. President.
For them, it is not unlawful for the PNP to have a wiretapping device or equipment.
Under
Nothing prevents
RA
them.
4200, it is not.
It is not.
It's not a violation. But under this particular bill, we are proposing to make it illegal, unlawful
Okay.
to even possess.
We will get to that later on, Mr. President. Again, does the government have today wiretapping devices or equipment?
Goes without saying, I suppose they have, Mr. President.
Have they ever admitted to the committee or to us that they do have?
They will never admit because
So why should we trust them, Mr. President, if they cannot be forthright with us?
we want to encourage them to admit and use the equipment and apply for court orders to wiretap and gather evidence.
I see it otherwise, Mr. President. The worst is that it proliferates and that they use it. Every branch now of the executive department can do it, and without admitting to us or even without asking for a court order, Mr. President.
Because they're doing something illegal, even they're committing a crime, Mr. President, in
Now.
doing so.
Now, has any government agency admitted to wiretapping operations in the past?
I admitted during a Senate hearing, Mr. President,
Except for the one that you mentioned earlier.
because I was covered by court order. That's why.
If you were the chief PNP, I would gladly approve this measure, Mr. President. But since you're no longer the chief PNP, there seems to be a problem, Mr. President, especially in light of 6,000 deaths, maybe 7,000 by now, and the recent Korean kidnapping, Mr. President. It may send the wrong message, Mr. President, that one of the first bills we will pass is increasing the authority of the state to be able to wiretap individuals, Mr. President. Now, let me move on, Mr. President. Would the distinguished sponsor know if there were cases or instances wherein the authorized use of wiretapping devices led to the successful prosecution or conviction of individuals subject of the surveillance? Meron na bang nakulong dahil sa wiretapping?
Hindi lang walang nakulong, walang nag-apply ng court order, Mr. President.
Except for one instance.
Except for one instance.
Yung sa inyo na ginamit ninyo, nakulong ba?
Muntik na makulong, Mr. President.
So hindi nakulong. Buhay naman.
Buhay.
Buhay naman.
Namatay sa sakit, Mr. President.
Okay.
Eventually.
Okay, so Mr. President, so there is an admission that since Republic Act 4200 was in place, no one has ever been prosecuted or convicted.
I believe so. I
Because of wiretapping.
haven't heard of any case that was successfully prosecuted on account of wiretapping.
Okay, so one of the purposes of this bill is so that we are wiretapping so that we can prosecute and convict someone.
That's what I said earlier, Mr. President. One of the reasons why we have to pass this piece of legislation is to enhance the capability
Of
in
the state.
the evidence gathering capability of law enforcement.
Okay. Now, clearly naman, since 4,200, kailan ba pinasa yung 4,200?
52 years ago, Mr. President.
So, since 50 years ago, wala pang na-prosecute at wala pang nako-convict at walang umaamin sa law enforcement agency natin na meron silang capability at isang beses lang sila na pumunta sa korte para humingi ng pahintulot to wiretap.
Coming from law enforcement myself, Mr. President, I guarantee you, maraming mapoprosecute once we pass this bill. This piece of
Maraming
legislation.
mapoprosecute o
Maraming
maraming,
mako-convict, Mr. President.
maraming posibleng maabuso?
No, Mr. President, because we increased the penalties from 6 months to 6 years. We are proposing to increase the penalty from 6 years to 12 years. And
Okay.
even the fines, Mr. President.
Meron na bang na-convict sa illegal wiretapping?
I don't have that information yet, Mr. President.
Could we find out from the PNP?
We'll find out.
Whatever happened to the Hello Garci?
Walang na-prosecute, Mr. President.
Walang, yun, maliwanag, wiretapping yun.
Maliwanag, Mr. President, but wala
Pero-
naman nag-testify.
Pero walang na-prosecute, walang na-convict. So bali wala whether it's 6 years or 20 years or life imprisonment.
Walang complainant
Wala na
and kakaunti kami sa minority no, Mr. President. Kaya kami natalo rito.
Parang ngayon kami dito, tatlo lang kami sa minority. Okay? Now. Okay.
And besides, at the time, President Arroyo was enjoying immunity from suit, Mr. President. So even if she admitted openly that she was the subject, actually she was the subject of...
She was a subject.
Yeah,
Yeah,
of
but
the
those
wiretapping.
who wiretapped her,
Only one siguro.
she was a subject eh. So someone wiretapped her conversation. No one was ever brought to the bar of justice. for
Had Commissioner Garciliano and or former President Arroyo filed a complaint, then probably merong conviction nangyari. Siguro na-convict na sina Doble and the other members of ISAF who were involved. But then again, yung cellphone conversation, hindi naman covered ng RA 4200. Kasi digital ito or analog, but ito yung data to voice or voice to data to voice. So hindi covered. Kaya that's the reason why we are expanding.
Pero covered
Even-
na rin yun ng 4200. Voice communication yun eh.
Ha?
Covered yun ng 4200.
Cellphone.
Oo, whether it's cellphone or...
Walang nabanggit na cellphone. Dictaphone, walkie-talkie, landlines.
But even though, that is a communication. That is already covered.
I'm not sure about that, Mr.
Okay?
President.
Now, kung hindi naman pala nagamit yung 4200, why are we expanding the capability of the state to wiretap?
Anong penalty? Anong conviction? Prison mayor. There's a decided case here, Mr. President. GR number 121087, Navarro versus Court of Appeals and the people of the Philippines as respondent. This is a decided case, Mr. President. RA 4200 was invoked and used. The Supreme Court, I will just read the last paragraph. Wherefore, the decision of the Court of Appeals is affirmed with the modification that petitioner Felipe Navarro is hereby sentenced to suffer a prison term of 8 years or of prison mayor as minimum to 14 years and 8 months of reclusion temporal as maximum. So there's a decided case, at least one, Mr. President.
With regard to? What was the decided case about?
Use of wiretapping, Mr. President.
Yeah, but no one has been...
As an evidence.
No, is that violation of Republic Act 4200? Is that the
not
subject?
in violation of RA 4200, but with the use of wiretapping, availing of a court order invoking RA 4200, Mr. President.
But no one was convicted.
This is a conviction, Mr. President.
So may isang conviction
Felipe Navarro,
Okay.
sentenced to prison mayor.
for 4,200.
No, not in violation of 4200, but the law enforcement agencies availed of 4200 in securing a court order to help convict Navarro.
So nagamit yung wiretap.
Nagamit yung 4200. Nagamit yung wiretap, yung pag-record as evidence. The tape recorded conversation was used.
Had nothing to do with the wiretap. Okay. Our information with regard to that case is that hindi nagamit yung wiretap for the conviction. It was lawful for them to use it, pero hindi yun ang base ng conviction. Now, moving on, Mr. President. It is provided under Section 7 of Republic Act 9372, or the Human Security Act, that a police or law enforcement official or any member of his team may, upon a written order of the Court of Appeals, listen to, intercept, and record with the use of any mode, form, kind, or type of electronic or other surveillance equipment any communication, message, conversation, or spoken or written words of a judicially declared and outlawed terrorist organization, association, or group of persons charged with or suspected of the crime of terrorism or conspiracy to commit terrorism. In comparison, the bill under consideration by the body only requires the law enforcement or military officer to file the application to wiretap before the regional trial court. Does the distinguished sponsor have any explanation as to the difference between wiretapping under the Human Security Act and under this bill?
Before we leave the topic of the case of Navarro, Mr. President, I would like, with all due respect, I'd like to correct the impression created by the distinguished gentleman that the use of the tape conversation was not material in the successful prosecution. It is here in the decision, and I would like to quote, it says here that the tape played in court was the one he recorded, and that the speakers on the tape were Petitioner Navarro and Lingan. A sufficient foundation was thus laid for the authentication of the tape presented by the prosecution. So while it's not a standalone evidence,
Okay.
it was used.
Okay.
Somehow it contributed to the successful prosecution of this case.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. So, if at all, once.
At least one.
Once. Huh? Okay. Now, the question is, does the distinguished sponsor have an explanation as to the difference between wiretapping under the Human Security Act and under this bill?
Under the Human Security Act, first, the court involved is the Court of Appeals. Second, probable cause, yun ang threshold. In this case, in the bill that we are, or even under 4200, it was a CFI. And in the case at the present time, we are proposing to secure a court order from the regional trial court, Mr. President.
Okay. So, but in
And
the
the
Human
threshold-
Security, yes.
The reason would be reasonable grounds to believe that the person has committed, is actually committing, and or is about to commit a crime, Mr. President.
Yes. So, Mr. President, would the distinguished sponsor be willing to accept an amendment that we follow the Human Security Act, and if at all, leave it to the Court of Appeals instead of the RTC? As an additional safeguard, Mr. President.
I have some reservation, Mr. President, simply because I would like to help law enforcement to secure a court order more easily than securing it from the Court of Appeals. It will be more tedious because we know that Court of Appeals is we need to deal with the division, and RTC is more accessible to law enforcement agencies. Anyway, all the safeguards are in place. And
But this
if we
is an
follow-
additional safeguard, isn't it? It's an additional safeguard
to secure it from the Court of
from the Court
Appeals,
of Appeals,
and increase the threshold to probable cause.
the probable cause.
Probable cause is needed to file an information in court, Mr. President. And that's why I have some reservation also to increase the threshold from reasonable grounds to believe to probable cause. Kasi prosecution na po yun, Mr. President.
But think about it, Mr. President. Also in the bill, ilang araw ba ang pwedeng i-wiretap? 60 plus 30.
Yeah,
90
60 days with an extendable period of another 30 days.
Ang search warrant, isang araw lang.
10 days, Mr.
10
President.
days on duration. But when
On
you
duration.
conduct the search,
One day, once lang. You cannot recycle a search warrant, Mr.
correct,
President.
correct. So in this case, if you think about it, 1/4 a year pwede kang tiktikan. Parang search warrant din to eh.
Pero communication ito, hindi naman ito mag-i-impair ng hindi naman madidetain yung tao, Mr. President.
Hindi
In the
warrant
case of
ulit.
a search warrant,
lang, ha? Oo.
That's intrusion
Oo.
sa
Ito,
property mo.
Isn't this intrusion
This
also?
intrusion, but this is just communication. Intrusion into private conversations.
Yes, still. But still, can you imagine 90 days?
But
1/4
imagine,
the year. Parang sinearch warrant ka ng 1/4 the year.
but also,
90 days.
imagine, Mr. President, kung bibigyan lang natin ng one-day law enforcement.
Hindi ko sinasabing 1 day. All I'm saying is that in the Human Security Act, if I'm not mistaken, it's only 30 days. Now, may Court of Appeals. So why not Court of Appeals din? Sundan na natin yung Human Security Act. 30 days lang, extendable, another 30 days at most, and then Court of Appeals.
Pagka ganyan, Mr. President, parang ayaw nating...
Sa totoo lang, Mr. President, ako ayaw ko talaga. But I'm working with the majority here, and we're proposing amendments. And I will explain to you also a bit later on. Why is that so?
There's a reason for
It's a
the
careful balance naman talaga, I understand. That's why, that was my opening statement earlier. There is really a careful balance between protecting citizens from unlawful activities. At the same time, protecting citizens from abuses of the state. Now,
Ito kasi fishing for evidence yan.
especially today, Mr. President, 7,000 na yung namamatay. May mga head ng matataas na opisyalis na PNP na sangkot sa kidnapping.
Ibang kaso naman yun, Mr. President. No matter
No, I understand.
whether or not meron kang RA 4200 or meron kang wiretapping authorized by the court o wala, kung abusado yung police, abusado talaga yung
Tama.
police.
Pero ito kasi, if mamaya, when we take a look at the bill, it's like we're opening it up. Halos lahat ng krimen pwede nang i-wiretap din. We will get to that, Mr. President. Ha?
But to answer your question, yung 30 days against 60 days, empirical data kasi ito eh. Even in the United States, to build up a case, it takes 48 days. Ito yung normal period na yung law enforcement agents can build up a case.
Yes. In light of that, Mr. President, can the person whose private communications or messages who are the subject of wiretapping or surveillance be allowed to use the recorded communication if the contents or portions thereof are favorable to his case?
As for his defense?
Oo. Kung favorable to him.
Well, I'm open to that.
Sige. So at the appropriate
The point
time,
that you
maybe we
raised,
can-
I'm open to that, Mr.
Thank you.
President.
In
Because
other words,
anyway,
you must use the entire
the entire
conversation,
conversation.
not only portions of it.
And it's illegal. It is punishable to remove, to reduce. It is here in the provisions, Mr. President.
And the reason why I bring this up, Mr. President, because I notice, justice is about seeking the truth. Now, in many instances, the state may have information favorable to the accused, but the state will withhold that information which is favorable to the accused.
Under this bill, the state cannot withhold. They will have to deposit everything.
Correct.
They cannot even, as I said, reduce or even remove
And
portions
I support
of
that.
the wartap embassies.
Now, I just wanted it clear, if it's favorable to the accused, pwede ba dyan gamitin?
Talaga magagamit, Mr.
Okay,
President.
thank you, Mr. President. Now, would the distinguished sponsor agree with this representation that wiretapping as a surveillance tool should be as a last resort by our law enforcers?
That is so provided under the bill, Mr. President.
So clearly, maliwanag na dapat last resort to. So that's an additional standard also.
Wait, Mr. President. Tatlo yan, Mr. President.
Yes.
Na walang ibang available na ebidensya, and it will contribute to the successful or to the conviction of the recipient of the wiretapping act, Mr. President. And there's another one. So, kasama yung sa safeguards, Mr. President.
Okay. And then let's move on, Mr. President. No? Okay. With regard to the proposed Section 3H, Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement of the bill, page 13, line 14. May we know from the sponsor if all the telecommunications companies were consulted during the committee hearings?
We consulted the Secretary of the ICT, Mr. President,
So the telecommunication companies were not consulted.
and also the National Telecommunications Commission.
So government actors were consulted but not the private sector.
Meron mo tayong imbita sa I don't think we invited members of the telcos, Mr. President.
Okay, so they have no knowledge of this bill, the telcos, because they were not invited to the committee hearings, not consulted. Because here, in this section, it is mandated for them to assist
That is correct,
the
Mr.
law
President.
enforcement agency.
They're mandated by law to assist. Otherwise, there's also penalty,
Yes.
fine.
Yeah,
I believe
precisely.
so, Mr. President.
And eto ba pwedeng gawin sa Amerika o dito lang sa atin? Are they mandated in the United States?
US, kasama rin. Let me check, Mr. President.
Yes.
But most of the provisions of the bill, we also patterned from
Because
the US.
recently I came across a news item a few months back during the terrorism in America, and the state asked Apple to open the phone. And Apple refused because of privacy. Diba? Hindi sila napilitan ng Estado to open the contents of the phone.
US to.
And if at all, I suppose we should be consulting also with the telecommunications companies.
Mandated din sa US, Mr. President, yung telecommunication companies. And mas lamang pa tayo sa safeguard, Mr. President, kasi sa US, they allow a one-party consent. Sa atin, hindi natin pinayagan because I believe it will not pass the constitutional challenge in our country. Kaya while it was suggested, I believe, by the Secretary of Justice, no less, yung one-party consent, we did not include that in the bill, Mr. President.
Yeah. Mr. President, to improve on the safeguards again, would the sponsor agree that we create an oversight committee
Definitely, Mr. President.
to check the
I agree.
potential abuses also of the state as far as using this law is concerned? So at the appropriate time, maybe we can introduce amendments on creating an oversight committee.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay. Now, another item, Mr. President. Today, how many crimes are included in 4200 na pwedeng i-wiretap?
Tatlo lang.
How many crimes?
Yes.
It's in here, Mr. President. Under 4200, we have 12 crimes: treason, espionage, provoking war, disloyalty in case of war, piracy, mutiny in the high seas, rebellion, conspiracy, and proposal to commit rebellion, inciting to rebellion, sedition, conspiracy to commit sedition, inciting to sedition, kidnapping as defined by the revised penal code, and violations of Commonwealth Act 616.
So 13 crimes.
13 crimes.
Okay.
Under Senate Bill 1210, we added 5 other crimes, Mr. President.
Only 5 others?
Yes, coup d'etat, conspiracy and proposal to commit coup d'etat, robbery in band, brigandage, highway robbery, defined penalties, Article 206, anti-piracy, anti-highway robbery law, violation of the Dangerous Drugs Act, and the violation of the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2001, Mr. President.
And how many crimes are listed under the anti-money laundering law? As
Ayan ang
predicate
marami. Predicate crimes, marami po yan, Mr. President.
crime? So mahigit 35. So kung may 12 ngayon o 13 plus 35, 48.
But those are predicate crimes. We are addressing the Money Laundering Act as we passed it in 2001, Mr.
Yes,
President.
precisely. As amended. Now, for example, if we were to amend the anti-money laundering law in this Congress to include tax evasion, pwede na rin i-wiretap yung tax evasion.
Yung predicate crimes, Mr. President, hindi naman per se, hindi naman kasama dito sa coverage or sa exemptions. Ang sinasama lang natin yung violation ng Anti-Money Laundering Act, ano?
Not the predicate crime.
No, per se, no, Mr. President.
So how does that work, Mr.
Kung ang
President?
predicate crime na-commit through money laundering, mayroong predicate crime, then that's included, Mr. President.
Correct.
The
So it's
basis
more
is
than,
always,
in effect, it's more than 50 crimes already.
if we,
Halimbawa, because what are the predicate crimes? No? You have kidnapping for ransom,
hindi, meron na talaga yan,
okay,
even under
dangerous
4200.
drugs,
Kasama na rin talaga sa
Anti-Graft
expanded.
Corrupt Practices Act.
Ayan. May proposal dyan si Senator De Lima to include yung Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act.
Yeah, just, I want to intervene on that. A proposal to commit a graft or a proposal to commit corruption, does that entitle the law enforcement agencies to apply for a warrant to listen to the conversation?
No, Mr. President.
But that's what the law, the way it is phrased today.
Correct.
Well, as I
About to commit.
As I responded to you during your intervention or interjection the last time, Mr. President, it is not a stand-alone reason to apply for a court order for an exemption, but it should be supported by independent evidence that a person is about to commit a crime.
Nevertheless, Mr. Senator, a proposal to commit a crime, except in cases of rebellion, treason, is not a punishable offense.
No, Mr. President, unless you commit an overt act.
That's correct. So,
That
but
becomes punishable.
even if you do not commit an overt act, under the proposed amendment, your phone telephone conversation can be tapped.
On top of other circumstances or requirements under the proposed bill, Mr. President.
Yeah,
For 90 days. For 90 days.
yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
90 days because yun nga 48 days yung 60 days, binase namin sa 48 days. Ito yung empirical data na number of days needed to build up a case, Mr. President.
Okay. Now, let me continue. Meron din, what are the other? Wetting and masyaw, piracy on the high seas, qualified theft, swindling, smuggling, Electronic Commerce Act. Halos lahat na. Hijacking, terrorism, kasama na yan. Financing of terrorism, bribery.
Mr. President, kung huweting lahat masyaw at hindi naman nagko-commit ng money laundering, hindi po pwedeng makapag-apply ng court order to wiretap. Hindi naman basta pwedeng i-wiretap yung telepono ng o yung cellphone ng gambling operator or betting operator per se.
No, but remember, you cannot prosecute anyone for money laundering without a predicate crime.
Of course, Mr. President.
And there are 35 crimes listed in the Anti-Money Laundering Act. So
But
and then you're including this in the hindi anti-wiretapping, liberalizing wiretapping. Dapat ang title ngayon ng bill natin, liberalizing the state's
No,
authority
actually,
to wiretap.
we're not liberalizing, Mr. President. We're adding safeguards.
So, one of the safeguards I mentioned earlier is yung Court of Appeals. Why not? Halimbawa, during our hearing here, dun sa Public Order Committee of which you chair, Espinosa, CIDG, kumuha ng search warrant saan?
RTC.
Di ba may tawag din doon, suki? Ano yung finding ng NBI nga pala doon sa...
Everything is relative here,
Yes,
Mr.
yes.
President.
No, but what was the finding of the NBI?
We can have a more, shall we say, objective judge of the RTC than 3 justices of the Court of Appeals. Relative ito, Mr. President.
Correct.
It depends on the person or persons that you're dealing with.
Yeah, like I mentioned, ganito kasi yun Mr. Chairman. Originally, 4200 was created to protect the public from wiretapping. Okay?
That is correct, Mr.
And
President.
then it limited the state's authority to wiretap. Okay? What we're doing here now is, of course, to modernize the law, to increase the penalties, which I support. Okay? But also, we're increasing the number of crimes. Dati 12. Ngayon, may 35 and counting. Meaning to say, if we are to amend to include tax evasion as a predicate crime sa anti-money laundering, covered na rin yun.
Kung kasama sa money laundering as a predicate crime.
Yes,
But
precisely.
kung tax evasion per se, hindi authorized
Yeah,
yung court
pero
to
remember,
issue a court order.
remember, ano pa lang to the crime, you cannot commit money laundering without a predicate crime.
Of course, Mr. President.
Correct. So, pag
you
sinama
may-
mo yung, let's
but
say,
you
tax
may-
evasion,
but you
dito,
may commit-
securities code nga kasama
But you may commit a predicate crime without committing money laundering.
Correct.
That's the whole point, Mr. President.
Yeah, but no one knows yet about the money laundering until charges are filed Same thing with
No,
regard to
Mr.
the-
President.
Yeah, there are two
Remember,
offenses, the predicate crime,
Yeah.
and then money laundering is another crime.
No, Mr. President. Remember, the bank official will have to report to the council if there are suspicious transactions or and then that's the time that a predicate crime is to be determined. Hindi po ba? Ngayon, kung predicate crime lang, hindi naman pwedeng mag-apply ng search warrant, ng court order, kung hindi nagko-commit ng money laundering.
Nevertheless, the point is this, Mr. President. We are enhancing the crimes, and we're saying that more actors can now do wiretapping.
We're not enhancing crimes, Mr. President. We're enhancing the evidence-gathering capability of law enforcement. While at the same time, we're safeguarding.
We're increasing the number of crimes.
We're increasing the number of crimes.
Okay, now, okay. So let me go page by page, Mr. President. In section 1, I don't have a problem, page 1. Okay? Section 3, page 2.
No problem with the section 2, Mr. President.
Section 2 is...
That's an amendment of section 1 of...
Correct.
Yeah.
More or less, ito pinagbabawal.
Yes. It
So
shall be
wala-
unlawful for any
Correct. So
person.
wala akong problema dyan.
Okay.
Pinagbabawal. Okay? Section 3,
Section 3.
page 2.
Yan, pinagbabawal din yan, Mr. President.
Oh, pero ito ang tanong ko dito. the sale or importation by manufacturers, distributors, or any person of any mode. Okay? So the sale, importation, manufacture, and distribution. Pinagbabawal unless you get a permit from the DICT. Tama?
Yes, Mr. President, that's
Okay.
correct.
Why the DICT?
Because they should,
Hindi naman sila
sila yung proper agency na maging repository nung, sila yung mayroong database to monitor.
Ng pinagbabawal na gamit.
Yes, to monitor. Sila may technical capability to determine kung ano yung klase ng equipment that will be manufactured or imported
Okay.
para magamit sa
So
white
we are saying now that private entities can import, manufacture, distribute if they have a permit from DICT.
That is correct, Mr. President.
Okay. So, eto mga mag-i-import nito, mag-manufacture nito, magdi-distribute nito, magbebenta nito, sino ang pagbebentahan nila? Who are they going to sell to?
Paano yun, Mr. President? Second.
Yeah, etong the people that we are allowing,
Private persons.
yeah, private persons, provided that they have a permit from the DICT to import, to manufacture, to sell, to distribute, who are they selling to?
The law enforcement agencies, PNP, PIDEA, Cybercrime Unit,
Nakalagay ba dito yun? That they can only sell to these people?
because they're not authorized to apply for a court order, Mr. President. Ano
Yeah,
pa
but
gagamitin nila doon?
Nothing here talks about that they can only sell this to the PNP or the AFP. No, nothing here says that. It only says that pinapayagan na ngayon
Na
to
mag-manufacture.
have this equipment provided that they secure a permit from the DICT. Nothing here says that they can only sell to the government.
Well, at the during the period of amendment, if you want to
Yeah,
introduce
and that's
an
why I'm asking
amendment,
for a clarification.
hindi rin lang magagamit. They are authorized to manufacture with a written permit from the DICT for them to sell
Okay?
to the authorized
Okay,
agencies.
so in effect, we're saying
Kasi
that
pag
dami
ginamit
ang
nila-
gamit nito.
Pag ginamit nila, makukulong
Yun nga.
sila, Mr.
Okay,
President.
so pwede lang nilang bentahan ang Estado.
Yes, Mr.
We are creating a market for them. Is that the case?
That is correct, Mr. President.
So, magkakaroon ng proliferation of all this equipment, wiretapping devices.
Not necessarily so, because they will have to secure a permit from the ICT.
Correct. So,
And
parang,
if they're not granted the permit, they cannot import, they
parang
cannot
ganito yun
manufacture.
Firearms, bawal yun, kailangan ng permit.
Yes.
Marami
but
nagbebenta ng
maraming
firearms.
illegally possessed firearms.
Oh,
That's their lookout. Kasi
Correct.
pag nahuli sila
Correct.
without a written permit, may
correct.
kulong yan, Mr.
Correct,
President.
correct. Pero, the point is, here, we're saying in effect, why not just say, bawal to have this equipment? Bakit may written permit pa from the DICT? We don't want to have all this equipment proliferate in the country. Kung gusto ng PNP ng AFP,
Well,
mag-import na lang sila.
Kasama rin yun dito. Limited...
Hindi, tama. Sila lang ang pwede. But why allow private sector, private individuals
para mas maraming
to import,
choices,
to
Mr. President.
manufacture, to distribute, to sell? I mean, kung gusto ng PNP at AFP, let them just import it by themselves. Direct contracting or
Sayang
whatever.
naman yung talent ng Pilipino na marunong mag-manufacture, Mr. President.
And that's precisely my point. We might be proliferating this equipment in the
But
country.
that's-
Kung sinabi
again-
natin, bawal to,
Again, bawal naman talaga, Mr. President, without a permit.
correct.
Kaya nga, nire-regulate natin, dapat kumuha sila ng permit sa DICT.
So nothing,
in so doing-
nothing prevents the DICT from issuing these permits.
Well, they're supposed to be responsible
Yeah,
people,
but there
Mr.
is no
President.
safeguard here na sinasabi ng DICT. Ito lang ang pwedeng bigyan ng permit. Wala.
Mr.
Diba?
President, alam na ng DICT kung sino bibigyan ng permit. Well, kasi ang premise ng distinguished
No,
gentleman...
when we passed the DICT, hindi ko naisip na permitting authority sila eh.
No, because they have
equipment
the
of this nature.
technical know-how, technical capability to determine which of the equipment can be used for wiretapping.
Correct.
That's the only reason.
Correct. Yeah, but my problem here is, I hope the gentleman sees my point as well, we don't want that this equipment proliferate in the market. There is a chance for that. Kung sinasabi natin na state lang naman ang pwede,
Pero kaya,
pagbawal na natin do, and just let the state import it
that's the reason why it's punishable to even possess
without a permit.
without the permit.
Correct. O sige. So
No.
let's move on. We may not... I'm just putting this on the record anyway, Mr.
Yes,
President.
Mr.
I understand
President.
where the gentleman is coming from.
I understand.
Like I said, if the gentleman were the PNP head, without batting an eyelash, I will trust the judgment of the gentleman, papayagan ko this Senate bill.
Thank
But
you for the
since-
compliment, Mr. President, but
And the confidence, huh? But unfortunately, the gentleman is not the head of the PNP. So my job in the minority is to put some safeguards kasi pwedeng abusuin ng Estado.
yes, Mr. President.
So we're just improving on the safeguards.
We have
and I'm
the
glad,
same-
I think the gentleman has been very fair.
We
as
have the
far
same
as all the
attitude, Mr.
safeguards.
President.
Yes,
The more safeguards that we introduce or inject
yes.
in this bill, I'll be for that.
I suppose I will be outvoted here when I say that we will delete this authority to import, to manufacture, to distribute. Ako, my position is ipagbawal natin ito.
But it's really prohibited, Mr. President.
Yeah, but
Ipagbawal natin and only the state can import.
can import. No
Only the
private
state
individual,
can import.
no. If at all,
Only
yeah.
the state can import.
But
Wala nang authority of the DICT. Wala nang permitting. So that's just one point.
But Mr.
Yeah.
President, kung meron namang magaling na Pilipino inventor at state lang ang pwede mag-import, sayang naman yung talent ng Pinoy.
Oh, yung Pinoy.
Doon mo bilhin.
Kaya nga,
No, that you buy it from the inventor. Let the state buy it from the inventor.
that is correct, Mr. President.
But not allow the private person to buy it from that inventor.
Private person, no, the private person cannot buy from the inventor because in so doing, he'll be in possession and he's not authorized to possess.
No, with the permission of the DICT.
May
You can
possession
buy
ba
from
rito?
the private person.
I'll read again for the record, section 1-A, Mr. President. The sale or importation by manufacturers, distributors, or any person of any mode, form, kind, or type of electronic, mechanical, or other equipment or device or technology now known or may hereafter be known to science, knowing or having reason to know that the design of such electronic, mechanical, or other equipment or device or technology is primarily intended and useful for the purposes stated in Section 1 of this Act shall be allowed only upon written. So possession is not included here, Mr. President, even use. It only says sale or importation.
Okay, moving on, Mr. President.
Under 4200 nga, hindi bawal ang possession. But under this bill, even mere possession of such equipment, pwede ka na makulong.
I would stop there, Mr. President. Hindi na kailangan kumuha ng permit sa DICT. Mere possession, kulong. Sige.
Paano natin ma-account ngayon, Mr. President? Kung halimbawa, manufacturer, marunong siya, naka-invento siya, hindi niya na ito mare-register. Pwede niya lalo magamit ito.
Okay. All I'm saying is that, Mr. President, I don't think that we should open the floodgates for all this equipment to proliferate. Like I said, kung it is only law enforcement agencies ang pwedeng bumili naman ito eh.
Yes,
Hindi naman
because
pwede any other
walang
private
paggagamitan yung private
Correct.
persons
Correct.
other than makichismis, Mr. President.
Correct. Kaya, pagbawal na lang natin.
Hindi, bawal naman talaga, Mr. President.
Hindi, pero ito pwedeng hindi bawal, basta may permit.
at least nare-regulate, at least na-monitor, at least naka-record na nag-import siya.
Anyway, moving on, Mr. President.
Sige, Mr. President.
We have clearly a difference of opinion here. Okay? And then, of course, on page 5, as we discussed already earlier, it says here, it lists
Anong
down
section
all
eh?
the,
Section.
page 5.
Section
Section
Mr.
3. It lists down all the, section 5, it lists down the crimes here to be covered. Okay? And then, like I said, there is confusion with regard to 9160, the Anti-Money Laundering Act. I would prefer we list down all the crimes. Itong catch-all phrase masyado tong Anti-Money Laundering Act. Kasi may predicate crimes yan, mga 35 of them. So from 12 to 50 crimes. Halos lahat pwede lang i-wiretap. So this is my concern, Mr. President. Maybe tanggalin na hanggang Dangerous Drugs Act. Period. If at all. Ha?
Page 5 ba yan? Page 5. Mr. President,
Yes.
there's no way for the police agency, for the law enforcement agency to know that money laundering is being committed unless nanggaling sa Anti-Money Laundering Council. Sila naman magsasabi na there is a violation of the Anti-Money Laundering Act, and then saka ididikit to saka malalaman yung predicate crime. How would the police know that there's a violation of the Anti-Money Laundering Act?
Correct. But you know, so from here, it starts with the Anti-Money Laundering Council.
Yes.
Di
Yes,
ba?
Mr.
Okay,
President.
now, well, we have seen in the past abuses already by the AMLAC as well.
If you want to make this clearer, Mr. President, I'm open to that.
Yes, that's the idea. Ha?
Thank you,
Maraming
Mr.
abuso na ng Estado eh. Di ba? So, moving on, Mr. President,
Ako, Mr. President, with all due respect, sa tingin ko, mababawasan ng abuses ng Estado once na pinasa natin ito. Mas
If you-
maraming abuso pag hindi natin pinasa to kasi maraming violation, maraming magbabiolate ng
ako
ng
tingin ko,
private
if
conversation.
we have all these crimes listed down here, there is more potential for abuse. And then if we're opening up the importation, the sale, the manufacture, the distribution, kahit na may permit, mas malaki ang abuso pwede mangyari.
Without the law, without this bill being enacted into law, Mr. President, wala sa batas eh. Pwede silang mag-import, pwede silang makinig, pwede silang mag-possess, pwede nilang gamitin.
Okay, now,
Mamili tayo, Mr. President.
Ah.
Kung merong ganitong batas, mapaparusahan sila. Ngayon, mere possession is not punishable.
hindi, payag ako. Mere possession should be punishable.
It
Payag
should,
nga ako dun eh.
that's the reason why.
Yeah, pero like I said, going back to that issue again, I don't think that they need to get a permit from the DICT. Tanggalin na lang natin yon. That's my position. And we differ from that position.
Yung approach lang, but
Yung
we are on the
approach,
same
yes.
page.
Yes, thank
It's
you.
objective, Mr. President.
Yes, thank you. Okay? And then moving on, Mr. President. Today, sino ang pwedeng mag-wiretap?
Naka-specify.
Today, sa 4200.
Ngayon, law enforcement officers.
And when you say law enforcement officer,
State law enforcement officer?
Yung sa 4200.
Di ba peace
Ang word na ginamit, peace officers,
Peace
Mr.
officers.
peace
President.
officer. And who does that
Binago
mean?
natin yun. Nalis natin yung peace officers. Pinalitan natin ng law enforcement.
Dito.
Di ba?
Okay. So now we're saying, specifically, what does it say? Today, or under this bill, we're talking about the NBI,
Yes. PIDEA.
NBI under the DOJ,
Yes.
PDEA under the Office of the President,
Yes.
okay? And then, the PNP,
Yes, Mr. President.
anyone else?
Military.
The military.
AFP.
So everyone in the executive,
Everyone in the executive.
in the
Mr. President.
executive. Okay? So all these agencies, all units of the AFP can have wiretapping devices.
Yes, Mr. President.
Army, Navy, Air Force, lahat.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, so lahat. Okay. NBI, every region. Pwede. Hindi
Yes,
na
Mr.
central
President.
office. Okay. PDEA,
Any region, Mr.
any
President.
region,
Yes.
pwede. So maraming gamit to, maraming equipment.
Yeah, but with the court order.
Yes,
They can
yes,
possess, but
yes.
they may be held criminally liable
Yes. Okay.
for,
Correct, correct,
if they use
correct.
that illegally without the court
And
order.
then the PNP.
PNP.
So how many operational units does the PNP have?
Hindi, ng court order. Pero yung possession pag-usapan. Pero remember, Mr. President, it's
All
not
operational
practical.
units of the PNP pwede.
They may possess, but remember, for practical reasons, Mr. President, napakamahal nito. Kung every unit of the PNP will possess, ubus yung budget nila kabibili ng...
Yeah. No, nevertheless, I understand that point. But the point is lahat pwede.
Yes, Mr.
All operating units.
Yes, being law enforcement officers, they can.
So we are expanding those who can have this equipment.
Pero pag-apply
We're expanding the list of crimes. We're liberalizing the industry to allow for the importation, sale, manufacture, distribution. Okay? And in the past, only one case has been successfully resolved, or there was a conviction. None of these intelligence, or none of these actors of the state, be it the NBI, the PDEA, the PNP, admit to having this equipment. Many of them have never secured a court
Even
order.
now, if they have the equipment
Yeah.
and they use the equipment, makukulong sila, Mr. President.
No, precisely my point. So this is the point, finally, Mr. President. Okay? What I suspect will happen here, and I hope I'm wrong, all these government agencies, there is no limitation, they will have this ability
To our top.
to wiretap. Many of them will not even bother to go to the court
But they
to
cannot
get
use...
a court order to wiretap and use this equipment facilities for their intelligence gathering or tick-tick at the expense of
If I were with law
The citizen.
enforcement, Mr. President, and I have intention to wiretap, I'd rather secure a court order para kung may makuha ko, magagamit ko ebidensya. Because you cannot use the proceeds.
that is the correct for prosecution and conviction
Yes,
purposes.
Mr. President.
But you know, they can rationalize not for prosecution or pwedeng gamitin yan by-
Pang-blackmail?
Pang-blackmail.
Well, anybody for that matter can commit a criminal act,
correct.
but they have to be on the lookout kung mahuli sila.
Correct. I agree.
It's just
And
like
I said,
extorting money.
today-
If you're caught, then you're
Yes.
caught.
Well, today, none of these actors have admitted that they do have this equipment. None of them, as admitted, they lie to us that they don't possess the equipment, they don't utilize this equipment. But we have seen in recent memory that they have used this equipment. Okay?
Ayun.
Di ba? I mean, that's the
Ayun-
point.
Ayun ang
huh?
victim, ayun. Nandun sa dun.
And that's why, remember again, the purpose of 4200, when that was debated here, was to make sure na anti-wiretapping nga, bawal, pinagbabawal, a few exceptions lang. Here now we're saying, let's expand the coverage of wiretapping. We're liberalizing the law in that by adding additional
that's-
crimes
That's one way of looking at it.
and
but
without... Yes,
I'd rather
correct.
say that we are adding safeguards, so we're not liberalizing.
Yeah, it is my job in the minority to point
I
this
know
out
that.
there.
I fully understand,
Yes,
Mr.
yes.
President.
Yes, okay.
My concern is like how you interpolated Senator Bam kanina. I was joking Sabi ko, baka pag natapos yung interpellation, yung substitute bill na ni Senator Recto yung mabuong...
The original bill naman is Senator Recto's bill din eh.
Yeah, I know. But
The original bill. Anyway. But these are some of the amendments that the minority would like to pursue. And, you know, fairness, to give credit to the gentleman, the chairman of our committee here, I think he has tried to do his work and he's done a great job as far as putting all these safeguards are concerned, no? And like I said, if he were the chief PNP, I would immediately trust his judgment. But I think today, masyadong malawak itong, and you know, we are expanding it too much, allowing too many actors of the state to have this capability. That is our concern now, Mr. President.
Mr.
And maybe at the
President,
appropriate time.
if I had my way, ima-maximize ko yung number of crimes para na sa ganon, magamit natin yung court order to gather evidence.
Ang problema ko, Mr. President, wala akong problema sa court order, basta Court of Appeals. Ang problema, marami dito, hindi pupunta sa korte.
Pero, Mr. President,
Gagamitin lang yung mga equipment na ito.
Mr. President, it doesn't follow na pagka-RTC mas corrupt kaysa sa CA. It doesn't follow na pagka-RTC kulang na sa or mas kulang na sa discretion. It doesn't follow, Mr. President. And sa akin lang, gusto kong bigyan na mas mas malawak na access yung law enforcement. Say, a police officer assigned in Zamboanga or in Sulu, pupunta pa sila sa Court of Appeals.
Sa Cagayan de Oro.
Well, pupunta ng Cagayan de Oro, samantalang may RTC naman sa Basilan. May RTC naman sa Tawi-Tawi.
Ang problema, baka yung RTC sa Basilan, suki eh.
Well, meron namang Office of the Court Administrator who will attend to
Again.
abuses.
What was the finding of the NBI doon sa Espinosa Slay?
Well,
Bakit sinabi nilang pwedeng kasuhan si Marcos? Dahil yung hinahanap kong testigo during the hearing, yung
nasa
deponent,
Leyte, nasa Tacloban.
who they claim they brought him to the judge, was 100 kilometers away.
120 kilometers away.
Di ba yun yung hinahanap ko sa hearing? Na
But
saan yung
remember, yung mga judges na nag-issue ng search warrant, not just one judge, pati yung ibang judges na damay, yung nakapatay doon kay yung other drug lords inside the prison cell.
Correct.
They're now being investigated by the Supreme Court.
Correct.
And chances are, they might be booted out.
Yeah. One last question, Mr. President. Meron na bang Court of Appeals judge or justice na nag-issue
Sa human security?
ng search warrant sa loob ng kulungan?
Hindi naman nag-a-apply kasi sa Court of Appeals eh. Ang talaga application ng search warrant sa judge RTC eh. So wala talaga mag-i-issue ng Court of
talaga.
Appeals.
Okay.
Kasi hindi naman sila talaga nag-i-issue ng...
And that's why I
ang
was
ini-issue
asking
nila,
earlier.
Mr. President, Tiaro.
PRO. Okay. So, and that's why I was asking earlier, sa human security, bakit ginawa ng Kongreso noon na Court of Appeals si human security at saka 30 days lang?
Kasi nature ng crime eh, human terrorism eh. Kaya tinaas lang natin yung...
Sa Court of Appeals?
Yeah, sa Court of Appeals.
Okay. So, I think it's also because of it's an additional safeguard.
Yeah,
para
tsaka
hindi
yung
maabuso.
condition at the time. Yeah.
Yes. Well, anyway, thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the gentleman for giving this representation the opportunity to ask questions on this proposed measure.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Salamat.
I'd like to assure you, Mr. President, na basta pagdating sa safeguards, hindi tayo magdi-disagree. No? Yung approach lang siguro tayo nagkakaiba. Anyway, thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, there are still a number of members who wish, or senators who wish to interpellate. And so at this point, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1210 under Committee Report Number 4.
Consideration of measure is suspended.
Thank you. Mr. President, just some housekeeping, because the three other bills that are in the agenda will have to be taken up tomorrow and Wednesday. Particularly talking about the corporation code and the Pagkain Pinoy sa Batang Pinoy program, Mr. President. So at this point, Mr. President, pursuant to Section 19 of Republic Act 9729 or the Climate Change Act of 2009, may I move to designate the following members of the Senate panel to the Oversight Committee on Climate Change: Senator Loren Legarda as chair, Senator Juan Miguel Zubiri as member, and members Senator Juan Edgardo Angara, Senator Nancy Binay, and Senator Francis Escudero.
So constituted.
Then, Mr. President, with the consent of the body and after conferring the matter with the concerned committee chairs as well as the principal authors of the resolution, it pertains to resolution foreign loans contracted by the Philippine government within the last 15 years to the conduct of a debt audit, PS Resolution 253. From the Committee on Finance to the Committee on Economic Affairs, would like to transfer the primary referral, Mr. President. After going over the provisions of the resolution, it appears that the measure involves economic planning and programming, as well as planning of domestic and foreign indebtedness, which is under the jurisdiction of the Committee for Economic Affairs. So I so move, Mr. President, that primary referral of PS Resolution 253B, the Committee on Economic Affairs, and secondarily to the Committee on Finance.
This is Senate proposed Senate bill or
Yes, a resolution, I'm sorry, PS Resolution 253.
PS? Proposed Senate. Any objection? Hearing none, the motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adjourn the session until 3. I'm sorry, there is additional reference of business.
Yes.
A second
There's a
additional
second
reference of business. I move that we proceed with the second additional reference of business.
Any objection? Hearing none, the chamber will now proceed with the second additional reference of business. The secretary will do so.
Committee reports. Committee report number 28, prepared and submitted jointly by the Committees on Education, Arts and Culture, and Finance on Senate Resolution number 1304 with Senators Recto, Joel Villanueva, Joseph Victor Ejercito, Paulo Benigno Bamaqueno IV, Wing Gatchalian, Pangilinan, Sani Angara, and Ligada as authors thereof, entitled An Act Providing for a Full Tuition Subsidy for Students Enrolled in State Universities and Colleges and appropriating funds therefore, recommending its approval in substitution of Senate Bill numbers 61, 158, 173, 177, 198, 962, and 1220, sponsored by Senator Paulo Benigno Bamaqueno IV.
To the calendar for ordinary business.
Committee report number 29, prepared and submitted jointly by the Committees on Women, Children, Family Relations, and Gender Equality, Civil Service, Government Reorganization and Professional Regulation, Finance, and Government Corporations and Public Enterprises on Senate Bill number 1305 with Senators Pangilinan, Emmanuel Manny Pacquiao, Risa Hontiveros, Trillanes IV, Maria Lourdes Nancy Binay, Ligarda, and Sani Angara as authors thereof, entitled An Act Increasing the Maternity Leave Period to 120 days for female workers in the government service and the private sector, with an option to extend for an additional 30 days without pay, providing a parental leave period for adopted parents, and granting an additional 30 days for solo mothers, and for other purposes, recommending its approval in substitution of Senate Bill numbers 56, 194, 215, 457, 1152, 1153, 1262, and 1276 by Senator Risa Hontiveros.
To the calendar for ordinary business. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move to adjourn the session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Tuesday, January 24, 2017.
There's a motion that the session is adjourned until Tuesday, January 24, 2017 at 3 o'clock in the afternoon upon motion of the Majority Leader without any objection.